In my humble and admittedly biased opinion, President Harry S. Truman is one of the most fascinating people to come out of the Cold War. Now, runners-up, if I could throw them out there, might include Nikita Khrushchev, Nixon and Kissinger, Zhou Enlai, Lee Kuan Yew, Ho Chi Minh maybe, Stalin, of course. Truman, though, for this series, is someone who we're going to be talking about quite a bit. Not solely. The overall theme is the early Cold War, but I mean, if you know anything about that time period, you'll know that he takes up a fairly significant chunk in that story. What I find so compelling about Truman is that he's about as regular of a guy as you can get. He falls into the job of presidency by sheer accident, coming after Roosevelt, of all people, who dies on the 4th term. And Truman gets stuck having to learn on the job at a rather crucial time, when maybe it would have been nicer to have, someone more experienced at the helm. Despite that, he ends up doing a fairly phenomenal job, and the American public at the time hates him for it. He ends up being incredibly unpopular when he leaves office, which I think is a little unfair given the circumstances. Now, Truman isn't the only major player in the early Cold War, because you, of course, have to take into account his geopolitical adversary, Joseph Stalin, a notorious figure and a guy who you'd think would totally outmatch Truman in the realm of geopolitics. There's a case to be made. He outmatched Roosevelt and Churchill, although I'm not going to die on that hill. But there's a quote I quite like from the American ambassador to the Soviet Union, a guy called Avril Harriman, who we will be coming back to in a minute, but he describes Stalin as, quote, better informed than Roosevelt, more realistic than Churchill, and in some ways the most effective of the war leaders. At the same time, he was, of course, a murderous tyrant, unquote. Stalin is someone we're also going to talk about a lot in this video. He's a captivating figure in his own right, highly intelligent, ruthless, driven. He's described as having an almost unbreakable willpower. And you wouldn't think it, but he could actually be surprisingly charming, especially when it came to dealing with foreign diplomats. James Burns, the Secretary of State in America, had told Truman about Stalin in 1945, just before Potsdam, that, quote, the truth is he's a very likable person, unquote. That sounds weird given everything we know about him today, but if you actually read some of the memorandums between Stalin and the Americans, you can kind of see where Burns is coming from there. Stalin sounds incredibly reasonable whenever he's talking to, the West. He was slicker than you'd think, almost disarming in a way. But, Harriman's quote rings true. He was, of course, a murderous tyrant. Stephen Kotkin, in his Stalin biography, the second one in the series, writes a compelling description of the Man of Steel. He writes, quote, he emerged from the 1920s, a ruler of seemingly irreconcilable contradictions. He could flash burning anger visible in yellowish eyes. He could glow with a soft, capacious smile. He could be utterly solicitous and charming. He could be unable to forget a perceived slight and compulsively contrive opportunities for revenge. He was single-minded and brooding, soft-spoken and foul-mouthed. He prided himself on his ferocious reading and his ability to quote the wisdom of Marx or Lenin. He resented fancy-pants intellectuals who he thought put on airs. He possessed a phenomenal memory and a mind of scope. His intellectual horizons were severely circumscribed by primitive theories of class struggles and imperialism. He developed a feel for the aspirations of the masses and the incipient elites. He almost never visited factories or farms, or even state agencies, reading about the country he ruled in secret reports and newspapers. He was a cynic about everyone's supposed base motives. He lived and breathed ideals. Above all, his core identity was as heir and leading pupil of Lenin, but Lenin's purported testament had called for his removal, and from the time it first appeared in the spring and summer of 1923, the documents haunted him, provoking at least 6 resignations, all of which had been rejected, but left him embattled, resentful, and vengeful. He continues on a little later. A human being, a communist, and a revolutionary. A dictator encircled by enemies in a dictatorship encircled by enemies. A fearsome contriver of class warfare, an embodiment of the global communist cause and Eurasian multinational state. A ferocious champion of Russia's revival, Stalin did what acclaimed leaders do. He articulated and drove towards a consistent goal. In his case, a powerful state backed by a unified society that eradicated capitalism and built industrial socialism. Murderous and mendacious do not begin to describe the person readers will encounter in this volume. At the same time, Stalin galvanized millions. His colossal authority was rooted in a dedicated faction which he forged, a formidable apparatus which he built, and Marxist-Leninist ideology which he helped synthesize. but his power was magnified many times over by ordinary people who projected onto him their soaring ambitions for justice, peace, and abundance, as well as national greatness. Dictators who amass great power often retreat into pet pursuits, expounding interminably about their obsessions paralyzing the state. But Stalin's fixation was a socialist great power. In the years 1929 to 1936, he would build that socialist great power with a first-class military. Stalin was a myth, but he proved equal to the myth. Unquote. This is who Harry S. Truman, the failed businessman from Missouri, was up against. I'm going to start this story on April 12th, 1945, with the death of President Roosevelt, the longest-serving president of the United States of America. The Second World War is wrapping up in Europe. In Asia, things are a little more unclear. And in the White House, the obscure Vice President Truman is about to get sworn in as FDR's replacement in these most uncertain of times. He's described as looking pretty depressed about it. In fact, they all kind of were. The people witnessing the swearing in process, it was described as a very somber group with an inexpensive Bible, which kind of suits Truman's character. He gets sworn in as president beneath a portrait of Woodrow Wilson, which also becomes a bit poetic. There's a photo of this online. You can literally see on people's faces how serious the mood is. One of his first decisions as president, straight after he gets sworn in, is when someone asks him, for the reporters outside, will the San Francisco conference for the United Nations still go ahead? And Truman says yes. I'm going to mention that again in a second. Also, Truman gets informed, kind of ominously, by his Secretary of War, Henry Stimson, that they need to have an urgent discussion about an explosive of unbelievable power. And then he doesn't really say anything more than that, for the time being, at least. You can probably guess what he's talking about there. In the meantime, as word got out about what happened to Roosevelt, it came as a shock to a country who, by the way, was still at war. It's hard to overstate how much of an era the Roosevelt administration was. He was president for over a decade. Through the Great Depression, the start of World War II, he very nearly saw its end. Now, not to say everyone loved him, but you rule for so long and under such turbulent times, you become a kind of a cornerstone for normality. Then suddenly he's gone, and a kind of nobody replaces him. David McCullough in his Truman biography writes, quote, "To the country, the Congress, the Washington bureaucracy, to hundreds of veteran New Dealers besides those who had gathered in the cabinet room, to much of the military high command, to millions of American men and women overseas, the news of Franklin Roosevelt's death, followed by the realization that Harry Truman was president, struck like massive earth tremors in quick succession. The thought of Truman in the White House coming with the force of a shockwave. To many, it was not just that the greatest of men had fallen, but that the least of men, or at any rate, the least likely of men, had assumed his place." Unquote. It's worth noting, Truman himself was not particularly pleased by this turn of events. He was nervous, and understandably so. I mean, the pressure he'd be under, going from kind of a filler vice president to maybe the most important man in the United States, in a terribly important time too. I mean, it's not like he can relax and have an easy first couple of weeks. There are critical decisions barreling towards him that he has precious little time to prepare for, and the country needs leadership. People are looking to him to provide stability and direction. It's an unenviable position, and he's in it. He told one reporter that, quote, "There have been few men in all history the equal of the man whose shoes I am stepping. I pray God I can measure up to the task," unquote. In another instance, the day after he's sworn in, he makes one of his more famous lines. McCullough writes, quote, "When, the lunch over, he came out into the hall still looking tense, a crowd of reporters stood waiting. 'Isn't this nice?' Truman said, his eyes suddenly filling with tears. 'This is really nice.' In his years in the Senate, he had met no enemies among the working press. Reporters liked him, he was relaxed, easy with them, liked them individually, considered several friends." Truman continues, "Boys, if you ever pray for me now. I don't know whether you fellows ever had a load of hay fall on you, but when they told me yesterday what had happened, I felt like the moon, the stars, and all the planets had fallen on me." Unquote. Word spreads overseas about the events that have transpired in America, and the news naturally finds its way to Moscow. And here's where we're going to find some reoccurring characters. One being Averell Harriman. This guy was a Wall Street banker / diplomat. He kind of did both at the same time, which one might wonder about conflicts of interest, but whatever. He was the son of an Edward Harriman, who was an obscenely wealthy railroad tycoon, a guy who was said to have feared neither God nor J.P. Morgan. So Averell, the son, had access to that wealth too. However, like I said, he didn't fully stay in the private sector. He wanted to have a hand in the government too. Eventually, in 1941, a good friend of his, a guy called Harry Hopkins, who was a very powerful advisor of Roosevelt's, put a good word in for Harriman to the president. Now, Roosevelt knew who Harriman was, but was apparently pretty reluctant to give him a serious job due to Harriman's obvious power ambitions. For example, he donated sums to both Democrats and Republicans, even though the guy was apparently extremely stingy with his money otherwise. But Roosevelt finally does give him a job to help sort out lend-leases to the British. This was before America was officially in the war. He was useful in Britain for a while before being made a somewhat reluctant ambassador to the Soviet Union. Anyways, he gets told that Roosevelt is dead, and at 3 o'clock in the morning, he calls another recurring character in this story, Vyacheslav Molotov, who was Stalin's foreign affairs commissar. Very high-ranking figure in the Soviet Union at that time, and he's a real hard-nosed, old-school Bolshevik. He survived Siberia, survived the wars, survived the purges, although he gets in pretty hot water at one point, survives by the skin of his teeth towards the end of Stalin's life. He's an intensely ideological guy and a notoriously tough negotiator. The Allies used to call him Mr. Niet because of that. George Kennan, a US diplomat who we'll meet later, described Molotov as, quote, a tremendous old workhorse of the Russian communist movement, a man with the physique of the old-time barroom bouncer, with iron nerves and poker face, imperturbable, stubborn, immovable in argument, and withal a master chess player who never missed a move, who let nothing escape him. Molotov had no personal vanity. There were no histrionics in his nature. It was a matter of indifference to him what those on the other side thought of him. He was the perfect tool for his master and the party, the nearest thing known to a human machine, unquote. Another quote I quite like is from Nikita Khrushchev's memoirs, which aren't necessarily always reliable for reasons which are a whole nother can of worms, but his take on Molotov I think is quite accurate. He writes this, quote, it's generally known that he was a harsh, abrupt person. When he was convinced that he was right, he could be not only sharp but unrestrained. His harshness was never expressed in an insulting form, but in the impassioned attitude he took, the conviction that he was right. Things should be decided precisely the way he thought. He continues on a little later. He was like a clockwork mechanism. Once it had been wound up, it would keep going as long as the wheels and gears kept turning, until the entire wound-up spring had unwound. He was a very stiff and awkward man, quite inflexible in his thinking, unquote. When Harriman told him the news of Roosevelt's passing, though, he was apparently pretty upset about it. Harriman wrote that he'd never heard Molotov talk so earnestly. They lamented about Roosevelt's passing. Molotov told him that, quote, all of Russia would mourn his death, unquote. A point I should mention here is when people in this time period call it Russia, they mean the Soviet Union. It's not me mixing it up. The Soviet Union is made up of more than just Russia and Russians. It's a multi-ethnic place, but its inhabitants, the technically correct name for them is Soviets. You'll be hard-pressed, though, to find anyone in the primary sources that makes that distinction. Everyone just calls them Russians. Stalin himself, who was Georgian, used to call them Russians, and that was so notable to Lovin, a Yugoslavian communist who met him, that he wrote about it in his book Conversations with Stalin. He noted that he thought it was weird for Stalin to do that. Anyways, coming back to Harriman. He's stuck in Moscow at the moment, but he's itching to go back to America because he wants to advise this new president, Truman, about the Soviet Union. But his boss, a guy called Stettinius, basically tells him no, that they need him in Moscow now more than ever, which was not what Harriman wanted to hear. And he's so desperate to come back that he hatches a bit of a scheme. See, Roosevelt had pursued the creation of the new United Nations, and he'd been anxious for Molotov to attend its grand opening in San Francisco. The Soviets were kind of dragging their heels about it. But if Harriman could convince Stalin to send Molotov over to America to attend that grand opening, not only would it be a gesture of goodwill by the Soviets, it'd also be a convenient excuse for Harriman himself to come back. So a few hours later, he meets with Joseph Stalin, and Molotov is there too. The whole conversation is captured in a memorandum, and Harriman starts it off by writing, quote, "When I entered Marshal Stalin's office, I noticed that he was obviously deeply distressed at the news of the death of President Roosevelt. He greeted me in silence and stood holding my hand for about 30 seconds before asking me to sit down." Unquote. Stalin goes on to ask him how he died, nothing particularly interesting, but then the conversation turns towards policy, and there are some really notable things to mention here. For one, Harriman has to soft launch Truman to the Soviets, but consider the bigger picture here too. This conversation took place in April 1945. The war in Europe is basically over. That being said, the Germans are still putting up resistance, and it's pretty stiff resistance on the Eastern Front, but the Red Army is hell-bent on victory, and they're about to bring everything they can down on Berlin. Now, while that war is raging on the front lines, the big three, meaning Roosevelt, Churchill and Stalin, had been bickering in the background. Sure, everyone was technically allies, but cracks were forming. The reason I say this is, during Harriman's conversation with Stalin, Harriman mentions the president's last message. That last message was one of a series of messages between the big three, and it had to do with an incident in Switzerland. See, there were still some German holdouts in northern Italy, and an American OSS agent, Alan Dulles, a notorious figure if you know anything about him, had some surrender negotiations with a high-level German official, an SS man called Karl Wolff. These negotiations were a bit of a mess. The Americans weren't even totally sure if the Germans could be taken seriously or not. The Soviets were informed of this, but they weren't a part of those talks, which led to a lot of friction between the Allies, and the result was an exchange of tough letters. In a previous draft of this, I went through most of those letters, but it took like an hour and I thought that was a little excessive, so I'm going to give you the rundown. Basically, the Americans were saying that the initial meetings with the Germans in Switzerland was just a feeling out process, and that the actual peace talks, if there were going to be any, would have Soviets present. The Soviets, however, were outraged that any talks at all were happening without their presence, and this is how the back and forth goes. Roosevelt is kind of waving the situation off, saying how it's all just a big misunderstanding, that Stalin maybe hasn't got the right information of events, and Stalin's like, no, I'm well informed. You had talks with the enemy without us being there, which, if we're supposed to be allies, is against the rules. To which Roosevelt basically says that, one, the talks in Switzerland were just to see if they would surrender. They weren't the actual surrender negotiations themselves. Those would be in Italy, and the Soviets would be present. Two, we had to at least see if there was a possibility for surrender, because there's American lives at stake. Roosevelt writes to Stalin, quote, "You as a military man will understand the necessity for prompt action to avoid losing an opportunity. It is in the same category as would be the sending of a flag of truce to your general at Königsberg or Danzig." He continues on, "I am sure that when a similar opportunity comes on the Soviet front, you will have the same attitude and will take the same action." Unquote. That argument falls on deaf ears a bit for Stalin, because those Germans on his front are encircled. They literally have no other option than to surrender or be annihilated. They can't escape back to Germany the way the Germans in northern Italy can. And he kind of accuses his Western allies of cutting some kind of separate peace deal with the Germans as a whole, some kind of collusion. He literally says he cannot understand why he was refused participation, and that this entire matter is basically extremely damaging to the preservation of trust between allies. At one point he throws some shade at the British by saying, quote, "I also cannot understand the silence of the British, who have allowed you to correspond with me on this unpleasant matter, and they themselves remain silent, although it is known that the initiative in this whole affair with the negotiations in Bern belongs to the British." Unquote. To which Churchill responds by writing to Stalin saying, quote, "In the interest of Anglo-Russian relations, His Majesty's government decided not to make any reply to this most wounding and unfounded charge, but to ignore it. We thought it better to keep silent than to respond to such a message as was sent by Mr. Molotov, but you may be sure that we were astounded by it and affronted that Mr. Molotov should impute such conduct to us. This, however, in no way affected our instructions to Field Marshal Alexander to keep you fully informed. Neither is it true that the initiative in this matter came, as you state to the President, wholly from the British. In fact, the information given to Field Marshal Alexander that the German General Wolf wished to make a contact in Switzerland was brought to him by an American agency, unquote. This accusation that he throws out is indicative of a distaste, one might nearly say hatred, that Stalin has for the British. You'll see what I mean by that in a while. Now, at the same time, Churchill is playing his own games here. He's writing to Roosevelt, trying to cement the US-UK relationship against the Soviets, as he would do again with Truman. Churchill writes to Roosevelt and says that he is astounded that the Soviets insult the honour of the United States and Great Britain. And then he says that he has no doubt that the Soviets are, quote, surprised and disconcerted at the rapid advance of the Allied armies in the West, unquote. He continues hatching a bit of a scheme. He says, quote, all of this makes it more important that we should join hands with the Russian armies as far to the east as possible and, if circumstances allow, enter Berlin, unquote. He says that the Russians didn't send confirmation on those zones we agreed to split Austria into, and they might end up occupying all of it, so, quote, it may be well prudent for us to hold as much as possible in the north, unquote. Churchill ends his letter to Roosevelt by saying, quote, I deem it of the highest importance that a firm and blunt stand should be made at this juncture by our two countries, in order that the air may be cleared, and they realise there is a point beyond which we will not tolerate insult. I believe this is the best chance of saving the future. If they are ever convinced that we are afraid of them and can be bullied into submission, then indeed I should despair of our future relations with them, and much else, unquote. I'll read a portion of Stalin's last message to Roosevelt because I think it sums up his entire side of things in his own words. He writes, quote, in my message of April 3rd, I spoke not about honesty and dependability. I never doubted your honesty and dependability, as well as the honesty and dependability of Mr. Churchill. I speak about the fact that in the course of this correspondence between us has revealed a difference of opinions as to what an ally can allow himself to do in respect to the other ally, and what he should not allow himself to do. We Russians believe that in the present situation at the fronts, when the enemy is confronted by the inevitability of capitulation, at any meeting with the Germans on question of capitulation by representatives of one of the allies, arrangements have to be made for the participation in this meeting of representatives of the other ally. At any rate, this is absolutely necessary if this ally is seeking participation in such a meeting. Americans, however, and the Englishmen think differently, considering the Russian point of view wrong. Proceeding from this fact, they rejected the Russians the right to participation in the meeting with the Germans in Switzerland. I have already written to you, and consider it not unnecessary to repeat, that the Russians in a similar situation under no circumstances would have refused the Americans and Englishmen the right for participation in such a meeting. I continue to consider the Russian point of view as the only right one, as it excludes any possibility of mutual distrust and does not permit the enemy to sow distrust among us, unquote. Finally, Roosevelt writes his last letter to Stalin, and it's basically a wave away of the whole problem. He writes, quote, thank you for your frank explanation of the Soviet point of view of the Bern incident, which now appears to have faded into the past without having accomplished any useful purpose, unquote. By the time Stalin got that letter, Roosevelt was dead. This was one of the last political acts he ever did. And it's where we pick back up with Harriman in Moscow. So you see the kind of atmosphere that preceded this meeting. Keep in mind, the Soviets had like 12 years of experience with Roosevelt, and now Harriman had to introduce the new guy. Stalin assumes this new change in presidents won't cause any change in policy, and Harriman agrees. Harriman explained that Truman was a man Stalin would like, that Truman was a man of action and not words, nor was he one to seek publicity. Harriman continues, I said that I was satisfied that President Truman would carry out President Roosevelt's plans precisely as he understood them, unquote. Stalin was apparently pretty pleased by that, but Harriman also says that Truman was not particularly famous. He didn't have Roosevelt's prestige, although Harriman thought that Truman would win the American people's confidence. It's worth saying here, while Truman wasn't that well known to the Soviets, the one thing they did know about him was probably the worst thing they could have known about him. Truman had said in June 1941, the month the USSR got invaded, that, quote, if we see that Germany is winning, we ought to help Russia, and if Russia is winning, we ought to help Germany. That way, we let them kill as many as possible, unquote. This naturally was not that reassuring to the Soviets, but they didn't let on. Anyways, remember when I said that Harriman had a plan to come back to America? Well, he starts his sales pitch for that plan. He says that Stalin could maybe assist the new president a bit here. Everyone in America knew, he continued, that Roosevelt and Stalin had a great personal relationship and that this had a great effect on the Soviet-American relations, to which Stalin interjected, quote, "President Roosevelt has died, but his cause must live on. We shall support President Truman with all our forces and all our will," unquote. Harriman then makes a humble suggestion of what Stalin could do more specifically to help Truman. Harriman says, quote, "I believe that the most effective way to assure the American public and the world at large of the desire of the Soviet government to continue collaboration with us and the United Nations would be for Mr. Molotov to go to the United States at this time. I suggested that he might stop in Washington to see the president and then proceed to San Francisco, even though he might remain there only for a few days," unquote. Molotov, seemingly under pressure, was not enthused about this idea, but Harriman continues on the sales pitch by explaining how much this would mean to the American people and President Truman himself in this very tragic time. That, quote, "the entire world would regard this visit as a great stabilizing influence," unquote. Stalin and Molotov chatted over a little bit before Stalin states categorically that, quote, "Mr. Molotov's trip to the United States, although difficult at this time, would be arranged," unquote. And just like that, Harriman had his ticket home. As it happened, Molotov wanted to go the long way around through Soviet territory, which allowed an anxious Harriman to go westward, which was quicker. He'd have about a day or so with Truman before Molotov arrived. Back in Washington, Truman was getting a crash course into foreign policy, which he knew nothing about. Roosevelt didn't tell him anything. For what it's worth, he didn't really tell others a whole lot either. Roosevelt liked to handle foreign policy by himself, which was a problem because apart from the United Nations initiative, it wasn't clear what US foreign policy was supposed to look like after the war in relation to the Soviet Union. And I mean specifically, vague notions about international cooperation is all well and good, but it doesn't count for much given the potential day-to-day issues you're facing in 1945. Cooperation between the Allies worked because there was a common enemy, but soon that common enemy would be gone, and what would be left would be two major powers with contrasting economic and political systems. So how do you maintain good relations like that, especially when there's the question of what to do with the destroyed Europe and Asia? What do you do if the goodwill turns sour? Roosevelt had done a lot for the Soviets. He spent a lot of time with them. He felt like he could deal with them. And Roosevelt stated in 1943, for example, that, quote, "If I give Stalin everything I possibly can and ask nothing in return, noblesse oblige, he won't try to annex anything and will work with me for a world of peace and democracy," unquote. That sentiment had maybe begun to change though, because in late March 1945, the month before he died, when the situation over Switzerland was heating up, he was given a telegram from Harriman, and according to Anna Rosenberg Hoffman, who was present, Roosevelt banged his fist on his wheelchair and said, quote, "Avril is right, we can't do business with Stalin," unquote. Now, like I said, Roosevelt died a few weeks after this, so whatever thoughts he had about the future with Moscow, I don't know. But it raises a point here on Stalin himself and how inconsistent the Western leaders were when talking about the guy. Granted, Stalin could be an inconsistent person himself. Even some of his own underlings that spent the most time with him said that the Stalin you met depended on when you met him. For instance, Kaganovich said about him that, quote, "The post-war was a different Stalin. The pre-war different. Between 32 and the 40s different. Until 32, completely different. He changed. I saw no fewer than 5-6 different Stalins," unquote. The same thing can be said about the West's opinion on him, because their opinions change depending on the time frame. Of course, the wartime alliance softened relations considerably, and it led to a belief that Stalin might be someone you could deal with in the post-war world where international cooperation is highly desirable. Roosevelt, for the most part, was big on cooperation. Churchill was less idealistic about it because, like, on one hand, he'd say things like, "Oh, if I could have dinner with Stalin at least once a week, there'd be no trouble at all." But at the same time, he never was a fan of the Soviets, trusted them very little, and would try to lobby Roosevelt to capture as much territory in Europe and try and strengthen their bargaining position in the post-war world. Among the American diplomats who dealt with the Soviets firsthand, you had a range of opinions there too, although they were mostly negative. You had the likes of Joseph Davies, who was, I'd say, the most pro-Soviet out of the lot. He was an ambassador to the Soviet Union and wrote a book about it titled Mission to Moscow, which later became a film designed to humanize the Soviets for the American audience in World War II. And Davies himself had full editorial control over the movie, and so it ended up being, a pro-Soviet film, which suited Roosevelt at the time. The Soviets, including Stalin himself, actually watched the film, and according to one ambassador's memorandum, they apparently cringed at it. The ambassador wrote, quote, "All the Americans present who expressed an opinion to me felt that the film was received with rather glum curiosity and doubted if Americans' Hollywood treatment of events described in Davies' book met with the general approval of the Russians. They successfully refrained from unfavourable comment while the film was being shown, but Stalin was heard to grunt once or twice. The glaring discrepancies must have provoked considerable resentment among the Soviet officials present. Its abject flattery of everything Russian and the ill-advised introduction of unpleasant events in Soviet internal history that I am inclined to think the Kremlin would prefer to forget makes me believe that the Russians will not desire to give publicity to the film, at least in its present form. In any event, I feel that the film will not contribute to a better understanding between the two countries." Unquote. Now that entire memorandum, if you read it, is certainly not flattering to Davies. Davies was not that well respected among the Western diplomats. He took a much harsher line on the Soviet Union than he. The other Soviet experts pretty much watched in horror at Davies and Roosevelt's pro-Soviet attitudes. Charles Chip Bolin was one such expert. He said that Roosevelt didn't have, quote, "any real comprehension of the great gulf that separated the thinking of a Bolshevik from a non-Bolshevik, and particularly from an American," unquote. Another Soviet expert, a guy called George Kennan, later wrote, quote, "I mean by that FDR's well-known conviction that although Stalin was a rather difficult character, he was at bottom a man like everyone else. That the only reason why it had been difficult to get on with him in the past was because there was no one with the right personality, with enough imagination and trust to deal with him properly. That the arrogant conservatives in the Western capitals had always bluntly rejected him, and that his ideological prejudices would melt away and Russian cooperation with the West could easily be obtained, if only Stalin was exposed to the charm of a personality of FDR's caliber. There were no grounds at all for this assumption. It was so childish that it was really unworthy of a statement of FDR's standing," unquote. Now, Bolin and Kennan are actually deeply involved in this story too. These guys are some of the most experienced Soviet experts America had in 1945. They were quote-unquote Russian specialists since America had officially recognized the Soviet Union in 1933. For context, the Soviet Union was officially formed in 1922. They had spent all that time without being officially recognized by the US, and by the way, it was Roosevelt who recognized them. He had a few motivations for this. The juicy potential of an expanded Russian market was one of them, this being the height of the Great Depression after all. Geopolitical counterbalancing was another, since Japan was being aggressive in the East, and America's hope was that the Soviet Union would offset that. Anyways, prior to this recognition, America's quote-unquote Russian specialists couldn't actually be in Soviet Russia. They had to be based in Estonia or Latvia, which wasn't Russia. It had been technically a few years prior when the empire was still around, but in the post-war years this was the best you were going to get if you were an American official. Second problem was, the Russians you found outside of Russia were not quite the same as the ones you found inside it. The ones outside it were typically the ones that fled. They left after the Civil War, so generally they weren't Bolsheviks. They didn't like the new government and they could be pretty vocal about it. But this is all you had access to prior to 1933, and it's who the likes of Bolin and Kennan lived with. For example, Bolin knew one pair of emigre sisters that, quote, came from Leningrad, which they always referred to by its pre-war name of St. Petersburg. Both were strongly anti-Bolshevik and lived in the hope that someday the nightmare would pass away and they would return to old Russia, complete with Tsar and aristocracy. One of the sisters was well educated and had been a teacher in the Smolny Institute, a school for the daughters of the Russian nobility, which the Bolsheviks had seized and used as a headquarters before the October Revolution. It was she who inspired my interest in Russian literature. the classics of Tolstoy, Dostoevsky, Turgenev, Chekhov, and others, unquote. The combination of living with white Russians and the influence of their superior, a guy called Robert Francis Kelly, who brought the lads into the Foreign Service in the first place and was himself a Tsarist Russophile, it's not a surprise that Bolin and Kennan's view on the Soviet Union were not particularly positive. The authors of the book, The Wise Men, Six Friends and the World They Made, write a little about this Kelly character's influence on the lads. It reads, quote, "The driving force behind the program was Kennan's old boss in the Eastern European Division, Robert Kelly, a tall, taciturn bachelor who had been educated at Harvard and the Sorbonne. Kelly spoke Russian fluently and cherished a love for the Tsarist-era culture of that country. But he was deeply distrustful of the Bolsheviks, or the Bols as he called them, and adamantly opposed American recognition of the new Moscow regime. Kelly's Russian training program virtually guaranteed a certain product. It included up to 3 years of study at a European university, followed by a posting in Riga, Latvia, or one of the other Baltic country capitals that served as a US listening post on the Soviet Union. His purpose, explained Kennan, was to replicate the training of a well-educated Russian of the old pre-revolutionary school. Kelly's anti-Bolshevik outlook and rigorous academic approach were to have an enormous influence on those who became part of his Soviet specialist program. To one degree or another, most came to subscribe what Daniel Jurgen has labelled the Riga Axioms. These included Kelly's fervent love of Tsarist culture and his disdain for the ideology and tactics of the new Kremlin regime. Among the first 8 officers chosen for his program were Bolin and Kennan, unquote. Between their training and their first-hand experience with Russian emigres, Bolin and Kennan harboured a great love for the Russian people, but a great distrust for their homeland's government. Kennan far more so. He didn't even like the idea of recognising them, and he'd complain about it almost every chance he could. Now, in fairness, he wasn't alone in this opinion. Other Soviet specialists had the same take, but Roosevelt went ahead anyways. He and the Soviet Foreign Affairs Commissar guy called Litvinov, Molotov's predecessor, made a quick deal, and by November 1933, official relations were established again. Funnily enough, one of the conditions of this deal was that the Soviets wouldn't interfere in US internal affairs by supporting American communists, a promise they broke like a month later. But whatever, as diplomacy goes, the US sent a gaggle of diplomats over to start an embassy, headed by the new ambassador, William Bullitt. This assignment hit close to home for Bullitt, by the way. Years prior, in 1919, when the Russian Civil War is still going on, Bullitt had asked then US President Woodrow Wilson for permission to go over to Moscow and, I quote, "see what the Bolsheviks are about," unquote. The president approved. Bullitt went over to Moscow to meet Lenin. Lenin offered him a pretty sweet deal for an armistice, although he might not have been all that sincere about it. And Bullitt comes back from Russia delighted with himself. But the mood had shifted back home. The senior leaders had lost their appetite for a deal with the Bolsheviks, and to add to the trouble anyways, a revolution had gone off in Hungary, so Bullitt and his deal was thrown out. He felt so betrayed about it that he actually resigned from the State Department in disgust. Yet here he was, in 1933, going back into the belly of the beast with his band of merry diplomats in tow. Although Kennan and Bolin don't come at the exact same time. Bolin is studying in Paris and Bullitt picks him up a little later. But for all of Kennan's tough talk about the Soviet Union, 1, he's actually kind of looking forward to going there, and 2, having chatted with Litvinov, who was on the same train as the American delegates, Kennan gets almost immediately charmed. He wrote, quote, "We suddenly realised, or at least I did, that these people we were dealing with were human beings like ourselves, that they had been born somewhere, that they had their childhood ambitions as we had. It seemed for a brief moment we could break through and embrace these people," unquote. The Wise Men book describes the American Party's first plunge into the Soviet Union. And keep in mind, they're going into a completely different world. There's no country like the Soviet Union at this point, and it's a mysterious place. Incomprehensibly large, all sorts of people and ethnicities living in it, and a pioneer of a strange ideology that the rest of the world regards with great suspicion. That being said, it's kind of exciting going into a place like that, especially if you're on high-level official business. The authors write, quote, "On December 10th, 1933, the Americans reached the Soviet border near Minsk. Kennan translated the speech given by the representative of the Soviet Foreign Office, a nervous man whose eyes sparkled with the importance of the occasion. Then there was a banquet in the station restaurant. The first of countless occasions when the Soviet cooks would produce lavish meals brimming with caviar and vodka, only to watch sadly as American appetites proved unequal to the challenge. The old Russian sleeping cars that carried the Americans from their border to Moscow had icicles hanging from their eaves. Kennan, too excited to sleep, watched as the Russian workers pumped hot water into the compartments at each switching station. Kennan writes in his journal, quote, "Russia, Russia, unwashed, backward, appealing Russia. So ashamed of your own backwardness, so orientally determined to conceal it from us by clever deceit, I shall always remember you, slyly, touchingly, but with great shouting and confusion, pumping hot water into our sleeping car in the frosty darkness of a December morning, in order that we might not know, in order that we might never realize, to how primitive a land we had come." Unquote. At a later point, Bolin gives another descriptive insight which I think fleshes out the moment. He writes, quote, "The odour of wet sheepskins coats, of sawdust spread on the floors to absorb moisture, of disinfectant, of pink soap, of human sweat, and of cheap Russian tobacco known as makhorka still remains for me the smell of the Soviet Union." Unquote. Indeed, the Soviets were keen to make a strong impression on the Americans. Bullitt wrote in a letter to Roosevelt on how they were treated after crossing the border for the first time, quote, "All of our party were impressed by the fact that the Russians seemed almost pathetically eager to please us. I learned later that this was the first time that any ambassador on arrival had been greeted by an official representative at the frontier." Unquote. Keep in mind the strategic position the Soviets were in late 1933. They had just experienced a brutal famine stemming from the collectivization policies. A famine that killed about 7 million people, with another 10 million nearly starving to death. It rattled the society, affecting the whole country, but hitting the breadbasket the worst, from Ukraine to the Caucasus, and places like Kazakhstan as well. It was not intentional, at least according to historian Stephen Kotkin. Nevertheless, the consequences were dire. It cast a serious shadow over Stalin's leadership, and it made the Soviet Union vulnerable to what was its principal threat in late 1933, which was Japan. Remember, Japan had taken Manchuria about 2-ish years prior, and they were poking around over there in the east, testing the Soviets every now and again. The Soviets in general saw threats all around them. It was nearly a pathological thing, capitalist encirclement, they talked about it all the time. But the Japanese threat was actually quite pressing. The Soviets were rightly convinced that the Japanese were eyeing up a war with them. But since the Americans were now in town, there was an opportunity to lessen the severity of the Japanese threat. Stalin meets with Bullitt, the US ambassador, in December 1933. Now, there are two versions of this meeting. There's the edited version and the unedited version, which was hard to find, by the way. But it adds another element to the meeting that the sanitized version doesn't. The Bullitt meeting took place in Voroshillov's apartment in the Kremlin, and the people inside, as Bullitt was told, constituted the inside directorate, the decision makers. Remember, Bullitt had met Lenin, whom he observed for the Soviets was a figure, quote, "not unlike that of Jesus Christ in the Christian church," unquote. Not only that, but Lenin had spoke highly of him, which Bullitt was told by a Soviet, quote, "You cannot understand it, but there is not one of us who would not gladly have his throat cut to have such things said about him by Lenin," unquote. So Bullitt had some clout here, although take this with a grain of salt, because the Soviets had a vested interest in showing him a good time. Bullitt was wined and dined, and Stalin proposed a toast to Roosevelt, who, quote, "in spite of the mute growls of the fishes, dared to recognize the Soviet Union," unquote. Stalin was being funny here. Hamilton Fish was an anti-Soviet politician in America. They also toast to Kalinin, who the Americans later nicknamed Old Daddy. Fun fact about this guy, earlier on, Kalinin had flattered Kennan a bit when he said that Kennin's older cousin's books on Siberia were the, quote, "Bible of the early Bolsheviks," unquote, which I thought was interesting. Anyways, after dinner, Bullitt and Stalin got to talking. Bullitt's impression of Stalin was a bit demeaning. He wrote, quote, "With Lenin, one felt at once that one was in the presence of a great man. With Stalin, I felt I was talking to a wiry gypsy with roots and emotions beyond my experience," unquote. Demeaning first impression aside, everyone gets on great. They fill Bullet up with vodka with toast after toast after toast. This was very typical for the Soviets, by the way, and Bullet is absolutely charmed. Stalin, who's again convinced the Japanese are about to attack in the Far East, asks to buy steel rails. He says, "I do not ask that they should be given to us, but only that our purchase of them should be facilitated. With those rails we shall beat the Japanese, but if we have the rails it'll be easier," unquote. Bullet continues, quote, "After dinner we adjourned to an adjoining drawing room, and Stalin seized Pyatakov by the arm, marched him to the piano, and sat him down on the stool and ordered him to play. Whereupon Pyatakov launched into a number of wild Russian dances, Stalin standing behind him from time to time, putting his arm around Pyatakov's neck and squeezing him affectionately. When Pyatakov had finished playing, Stalin came over and sat beside me, and we talked for some time. He said he hoped that I would feel myself completely at home in the Soviet Union, that he and all the members of the government had felt that I was a friend for so long, that they had such admiration for yourself," he's talking to Roosevelt, "and the things you were trying to do in America, that they felt we could cooperate with the greatest intimacy. I told him that you sincerely hoped that the war might be prevented in the Far East, and that the Soviet government might work out its great experiment in peace." He said, quoting Stalin now, "I know that that is what President Roosevelt wants, and I hope you will tell him from me that he is today, in spite of being the leader of a capitalist nation, one of the most popular men in the Soviet Union," unquote. Bullet continues, quote, "Stalin was feeling extremely gay, as we all were, but he gave me the feeling that he was speaking honestly. He had by this time made the impression on me of a man not only of great shrewdness and inflexible will. Lenin, you know, said of him that he had enough will to equip the entire Communist Party, but also possessed of the quality of intuition in extraordinary measure. Moreover, like every real statesman I have known, he has the quality of being able to treat the most serious things with a joke and a twinkle in his eye. Lenin had that same quality. You have it. As I got up to leave, Stalin said to me, quoting Stalin, I want you to understand that if you want to see me at any time, day or night, you only have to let me know and I will see you at once," unquote. Bullet continues, "This was a most extraordinary gesture on his part, as he has hitherto refused to see any ambassador at any time. In order to avoid the jealousy of my colleagues, I said to Litvinov that it seemed to me desirable that it should be made known to the press merely that I had been at Vrochislav's and that Stalin had dropped in, and that I had a talk with him. It was so arranged. It is valuable to have the inside track, but it seems to me not desirable to emphasize that fact to the world." After I said goodbye to Vorochislav and the others, Stalin went to the door of the apartment with me and said, quoting Stalin, "Is there anything at all in the Soviet Union that you want? Anything?" unquote. Bullet continues, "There was one thing I wanted, but I hesitated to ask for it. As Litvinov had told me that the Moscow Soviet had definitely decided it would not give us the building site in the center of the town's park, and that a map would be submitted to me showing that the new canal would run through the property. Therefore, I first said," quoting Bullet, "everyone has been more than kind to me, and I should hesitate to ask for anything in addition, except that the intimate relations we have begun tonight may continue," unquote. Whereupon Stalin said, "But I should really like to show you that we appreciate not only what the president has done, but also what you yourself have done. Please understand that we should receive politely any ambassador that might have been sent to us by the government of the United States, but we should have received no one but yourself in this particular way," unquote. He seemed moved by a genuinely friendly emotion. Therefore, I thanked him and said that there was one thing that I should really like to have, that I could see in my mind's eye an American embassy modelled on the home of the author of the Declaration of Independence on that particular bluff overlooking the Moscow River, and that I should be glad to know that that property might be given to the American government as a site for an embassy. Stalin replied, "You shall have it." Thereupon, I held out my hand to shake hands with Stalin, and, to my amazement, Stalin took my head in his two hands and gave me a large kiss. I swallowed my astonishment, and when he turned his face for a return kiss, I delivered it. This evening with Stalin and the inner circle of the Soviet government seems almost unbelievable in retrospect, and I should have difficulty in convincing myself that it was a reality if I had not, on returning to my hotel, awakened my secretary and dictated the salient facts to him, unquote. The secretary was Kennan, in case you were wondering. Also, this event comes back up for Bullet years later, and he lies about it. One source writes, quote, 13 years afterwards, by which time Bullet had become fiercely anti-communist, the remembered intensity powered a different discourse. Speaking as if he had been seduced and betrayed, Bullet warned Henry Wallace in February 1946 that, quote, these Bolsheviks are charming people, unquote. He could not resist describing Stalin's eyes and mentioning that, quote, Stalin at one point was very affectionate towards me, unquote. Bullitt related that, quote, he kissed me full on the mouth, unquote, but he did not mention the return kiss. Instead, he exclaimed, quote, what a horrible experience that was, unquote. Also, when Stalin here promises a certain site for a new US embassy, the Americans don't actually get it. For whatever reason, they run into bureaucratic problems when actually trying to build anything on the land. This caused all sorts of headaches for Bolin, who got so sick of the project that it was just scrapped. Bolin wrote home, quote, the Soviets are the worst people to do business with I have ever met. They'll try to take the gold out of your teeth, unquote. Harriman would later echo this same sentiment when he said that in dealing with the Soviets, quote, you'd have to buy the same horse twice, unquote. Anyways, the same month of the Bullitt meeting, December 1933, Stalin meets with pro-Soviet reporter William Durante, where he sends friendly signals out to the West in a more public manner. Durante writes, quote, of Mr. Roosevelt, Comrade Stalin said, quote, by all appearances, he is a decided and courageous statesman, unquote. Durante continues, of Ambassador Bullitt, whose meeting with Stalin in Moscow a fortnight ago was kept secret until after Mr. Bullitt left Russia, Stalin said, quote, I and my comrades liked Ambassador Bullitt very much. What I like is that he does not talk like an average diplomat. He made a very good impression here, unquote. Durante continues again. As if to make a good impression on US bankers and thus foster a new deal in Soviet-US trade, the dictator continued, quote, I know it is not customary to pay debts nowadays, but we do it. Other nations renege on their debts, but the Union of Socialist Soviet Republics does not renege. Confidence, as everyone knows, is the basis of credit. What I mean is that the volume of our trade with America, for the time being, must be measured by the degree of confidence America puts in us, and this by the volume of credit, unquote. Durante ends saying, quote, in genial mood, dictator Stalin then predicted for capitalist nations not the world revolution of the proletariat, but fresh prosperity after the present depression, unquote. Stalin makes a point here about being reliable with debt obligations. This was a sticky point between the Soviet Union and the West since Lenin had repudiated Tsarist debt. One of Bullitt's main objectives in the Soviet Union was to actually get some of that debt repaid. Now, it wasn't just the threat of Japan in the Far East that had the Soviets so worried. Any fight in the Far East, as far as the Soviets were concerned, would have just been a war of attrition that'd last years. Now, that was scary because while that war would be going on, the fear the Soviets had was that the Germans or the Polish would eventually start eyeing up the Soviets' western territory, and then you'd have a two-front war, and that's a major problem. So, for the time being, the Soviets were cozying up to the Americans to make the Japanese think twice and avoid a war altogether. The Japanese threat ebbed and flowed, but the long-term question of Germany lingered. Not just for the Soviets, the French were concerned too, and so the French proposed a pact to contain any possible future German aggression. The Soviets liked the idea and invited any other interested party to join in what became known as the Eastern Pact. However, Estonia, Latvia and Britain made it a condition that for their signature, Germany and Poland would have to sign too, which kind of defeated the purpose, and anyways the Germans and Poles quickly rejected the idea. So the French and the Soviets would start eyeing up a pact between themselves. Not with great haste, it should be said. The Soviets had to join the League of Nations in order to even pursue it, and also the Frenchmen who proposed the idea in the first place ended up getting shot. Eventually though, they do sign a pact, and it's essentially security theatre. The Germans ignore it, and the Western Europeans, who are desperately trying to avoid war, end up following a policy of appeasement anyways. The Soviets, for their part, would then reorientate their foreign policy, which I will touch on again later. By the start of 1934, Kennan was in Moscow setting up what would become the US base of operations for the foreseeable future, a place called Spaso House, which they actually still use today. That first year, going into 1934, really softened the junior diplomats' attitude to the USSR. US-Soviet relations at the ground level were well-meaning, if not a little clumsy. The authors of Six Friends and the World I Made wrote about some examples of the kind of mingling the Americans did. They write, quote, Bolin and Kennan were asked to become consultants to a local production of Charles MacArthur and Ben Hecht's The Front Page. The young Soviet actors had their own conceptions of American society. The city editor, for example, wore a top hat and tailcoat because the director assumed this was the normal style for bosses in capitalist society. The Russians seemed keen on nurturing the friendship. When Bolin, at Bullitt's direction, offered to teach them baseball in a local park, a group dutifully turned out. Their mild interest, however, declined even further after one of them was beaned by a fastball. Apparently, Bolin later wrote, they had been ordered to play, unquote. Also, in fairness to that Soviet theatre director, if you see the clip of Bullitt's trip to the USSR in 1934, he is wearing a top hat. Anyways, all in all, the going was good in Spazo House, and I cannot stress that enough. These guys were having a great time. They were having parties, there were ballerinas who were also spies just running around the embassy. One ballerina Soviet spy was named Irina Charnotskaya, who Charles Thayer wrote about saying, quote, we simply cannot keep our hands off her. She has become an acquisition of the embassy and sleeps in some vacant room which the three of us carefully lock together and then fight violently as to who will keep the key, unquote. The Moscow populace was eager to see what Americans were like, and the Americans were happy to oblige them. For what, you'd think is a pretty serious political mission, things were remarkably laid back, bordering on unprofessionalism. Apart from Bullitt, maybe, they also didn't really know what they were doing at first, but that was okay, because they didn't really have an awful lot to do anyways. Their first job was to get furniture for Spazo House, and that seems simple enough until they run into the impenetrable Soviet bureaucracy, which meant you needed to contact this union for this and that union for that, and then this would be late and that doesn't arrive, and it takes them ages to get anything. To add to the unseriousness of it all, Charles Thayer, who I mentioned earlier, was knocking around in Moscow at the time. He spoke a bit of Russian, he knew the area, had maybe the right familial ties, and when he met Bullitt and Kennan, they took a liking to him and basically said, welcome aboard. Hired him there and then, such were the times. They came to love this guy though, mainly because of his sense of humour, which I can vouch for. His book, Bears and the Caviar, is very funny. It's based on his experiences, but he's a bit liberal with the truth, I think. I mean, some of the antics he writes about are outrageous. And while some things I could verify, this is already pretty obscure history, so it's hard to fact check him exactly. For example, he wrote about one party the Americans threw in Moscow that supposedly involved a bunch of circus seals that went rogue, and as you can imagine, pandemonium ensued in the embassy. And even when they got the seals back into the trailer and sent home, after a lot of effort, mind you, Thayer writes, quote, later I found out that the journey hadn't been entirely without excitement. Halfway home, on a busy boulevard, Lyuba, which is one of the seals, still restless after her kitchen experience, had jumped over the side of the truck just as she had leapt over the wall of the chute to the kitchen stairs. In winter, the streets of Moscow are usually an icy composition of hard-packed snow, as slippery as the best skating rink. Lyuba was in her element, and took off down the boulevard at a mile a minute with the trainer's assistant sliding after her. Just how she was finally brought to heel I never discovered, but I do know that half the militia in the Arbat district chased her to the very edge of the Moskva River before they surrounded her, unquote. Anyways, as Bolin wrote about their first year in the USSR, quote, Henderson, Kennan and I realized that we had arrived in Moscow at an opportune time, for 1934 may be seen as the most optimistic year in Soviet history, unquote. Kennan would mirror the same sentiments, but by 1934's end, things would change. In December, Leningrad party boss and very close friend of Stalin, Sergei Kirov, had been shot. The mood shifted in the Soviet Union. The Americans began feeling a choking sense of xenophobia. The government began cracking down on who they deemed enemies of the state. Kennan noted in his private journal, quote, Russia, which had begun to reach out a hand to the West, had once more failed to find the ultimate self-confidence to complete the gesture, unquote. Days after Kirov's death, Kennan fell ill, and one of his friends brought him some books of letters from a pre-revolutionary mission in St. Petersburg. One minister had written about the Russians a century earlier, quote, These people are obsessed with a strange superstition that they are destined to conquer the world, unquote. Kennan ate these up. In his view, the difference between the Russian of the old Tsarist Empire and the Russian of the Soviet Union was negligible, that all communism represented was a new coat of paint. For Kennan, nothing had really changed but the locks. Kennan wrote about the letters saying, quote, "Most of what was written there was true in 1934 as it has been a century before," unquote. He continued, quote, "They were a wonderful support to our own feeling that Russia had to be looked at from a long-range point of view, that Bolshevism, with all its hullabaloo about revolution, was not a turning point in history, but only another name, another milepost along the road of Russia's wasteful, painful progress from an obscure origin to an obscure destiny," unquote. Bolin's view on the Soviet Union at this time was a little more mixed. He wrote home, quote, "A really accurate picture is impossible as the most incredible contradictions run side by side. Whatever has been written about the methods of the state police is true. I know personally of horrible things that have happened. On the other hand, I think they are pulling it off. Hope for the future and the real glorification of work are the two factors that distinguish this country. This spirit of optimism goes hand in hand with complete repression of individual liberty as we understand it," unquote. After Kirov's shooting, the Soviet Union was rocked by trials and purges that would keep the Americans busy for the time being. Also, by 1935, Ambassador Bullitt had been getting real sick of the Soviets, mostly from his own dealings with them, and partly through the influence of Bolin and Kennan. He wrote to Roosevelt just a few months after the Stalin meeting, when he came back to Moscow after a short leave, saying, quote, "The honeymoon atmosphere had evaporated completely before I arrived. As Wiley says, the Japanese have let us down badly. The Russians are convinced that Japan will not attack this spring or summer, and, as they no longer feel that they need our immediate help, their underlying hostility to all capitalist countries now shows through the veneer of intimate friendship," unquote. Bullitt's optimism had been completely destroyed. He'd been so disillusioned that Roosevelt would replace him in 1936 with someone more willing to keep the pro-Soviet line. That replacement was Joseph Davies, the guy who made mission to Moscow. Davies became the new ambassador when something of an anti-Soviet clique had formed in the Foreign Service. This was an occupational hazard when working there. The Soviet Union just seemed to ground US diplomats down. Bolin put it this way, quote, "Anyone who started with too many illusions about the Soviets came out totally disillusioned," unquote. Davies, however, seemed to be an exception, but as I said earlier, many members in the Foreign Service did not have love for Davies. During the show trial of Nikolai Bukharin, Davies accepted what he saw as a legitimate trial. Bolin, however, rightly did not, and privately criticised Davies. Bolin wrote, quote, "He had an unfortunate tendency to take what was presented at the trial as honest and gospel truth. I still blush when I think of some of the telegrams he sent," unquote. Though Bolin couldn't actually write an official analysis of the trial himself, apparently the only assignment in his career that he failed to do so. According to Bolin, quote, "I could not separate fact from fiction at the trial. I knew the trial was a phony, but I could not prove it. I could only intimate that it had no relevance to reality. Try as I did, and I tried for over a month, I was unable to present a convincing case," unquote. Although Bolin may not have been entirely honest with himself here, because according to Loy Henderson, the man who assigned Bolin the task, quote, "He said he would rather not write it. He knew the Soviets would somehow get a hold of it and that he might make them permanent enemies of his. He also knew that Roosevelt and Davies did not want to see negative reporting on the Soviets. He was so anxious to please everyone, he would never say anything that might get him in trouble," unquote. Kennan would second that opinion, saying years later, quote, "Chip tended to be very loyal to the US policy of the moment, even when it was Roosevelt's optimism, which he disagreed with. He did not like to fight the prevailing trends. I used to call him the partisan of the moment," unquote. As is pointed out there, Bolin could be a bit of a company man, so to speak. He didn't like to rock the boat too much for the people he worked for, but that's just the kind of guy he was. A pure diplomat through and through, and that's what people liked about him. He was a people's person, really. But while Bolin was a people's person, Kennan was not. He was more introverted, sensitive, perhaps a bit neurotic. Overall, he was a bit of an odd guy. This is how the Wise Men book describes him. Quote, "Indeed, despite Kennan's efforts to be sociable, his manner still tended to grate on his colleagues' nerves. When he began affecting a pipe, the others laughed at his professorial pretenses. When he churned out long memos and cables, they would roll their eyes. Later, much of his reputation would derive from precisely this penchant for writing long telegrams. Almost everyone got annoyed with Kennan after they first got to know him," Henderson later said. He was so engrossed in his own ideas that he never learned how to go along or get along. After half a year in Moscow, Bullitt had little use for George personally. He did, however, develop a great respect for George's mind. None of us took George's ideas as seriously as George did, but we knew that someday people would have to, unquote. The authors continue. Bolin, understandably, was far more popular. He had a pleasing personality, a keen sense of humour, a gift for amusing conversation, and a certain amount of spontaneous joyousness, said Henderson. In almost every way, Bolin was the opposite of Kennan. Chip was friendly, Henderson later recalled. He drank and socialised well, and he never seemed like a snob. Above all, he had a kind of manner that made people open up to him. He was a very good foreign service officer in the sense that he always tried to please those in power. He never questioned policy, except in private, where I think he tried to make everyone think he agreed with them, unquote. Despite their dissimilarities, or perhaps because of them, Bolin was one of the few in Moscow who could genuinely get along with Kennan. They frequently attended lectures and concerts together, and Bolin, after a night on the party circuit, often dropped by Kennan's room and sat in his bed for midnight chats. He would chide his friend for being too gloomy, both personally and professionally, and for getting so wrapped up in criticising policy that he found himself unable to execute it in a professional way. Kennan had, quote, a good streak of American morality, unquote, Bolin once said, and found it hard to, quote, divorce his visceral feelings from his knowledge and fact, unquote. Kennan's main problem with Marxism stemmed from what the authors of the Wise Men book call, quote, a rather prissy elitism, unquote. They write that on a visit to a resort in the Black Sea, Kennan was pretty contemptuous about the commoners at the hotel. He wrote in his journal, quote, had the fathers of the revolution really imagined that, once the upper and middle classes had been kicked out of these watering places, the members of the proletariat would move in and proceed to amuse themselves gracefully and with taste? Did they really fail to foresee that such simple people would make pigsties of these hotels and villas, would have no appreciation for sky and air and mountain scenery, unquote. Kennan's elitism led him to have some pretty out there views. He was not such a fan of democracy and how much power it gave to the unwashed masses who, in his eyes, didn't know anything. He greatly admired the dictatorship he saw while in pre-Anschluss Austria and how it carried out its business. He wrote in his journal, quote, there was no demagoguery, no public wrangling and debate by the layman, no appeal to the emotions and greed of the public, unquote. He also told one newspaper columnist that, quote, the trouble with this country is that we are a democracy and instead should be ruled by aristocrats, unquote. He also wrote an unpublished and I think unfinished book which ranted and raved about women and minorities. Make of that what you will. In regards to the Soviet Union, though, the authors of the Six Men book describes Kennan's emerging philosophy that he was slowly forming. They write, quote, its earliest clear expression came in a lecture titled Russia that Kennan gave at the Foreign Service School in May of 1938. In it, he downplayed the role of Marxist ideology in guiding Kremlin conduct and placed greater importance on the permanent characters of the Russian national character. Citing his discovery a few years earlier of his dispatches from American ambassadors at the time of Tsar Nicholas I, Kennan argued that both before and after its revolution, Russia had a definite personality that included the, quote, constant fear of foreign invasion, the hysterical suspicion of other nations, unquote. This deep-dyed national personality, Kennan theorized, resulted in part from the geography of Russia, a vast and cold continental mass that encouraged, quote-unquote, extremism rather than a sense of limits, and whose insecure borders prevented inhabitants from thinking in terms of a, quote, limited, well-defined territory, unquote. History also played a role. Centuries of invasions by, quote-unquote, Asiatic hordes had produced a system of oriental despotism and xenophobia. In addition, there was the influence of the Byzantine Church, characterized by, quote, its intolerance, its intriguing, and despotic political systems, unquote. Kennan's conclusion was almost Freudian in its determinism. He continues, nations, like individuals, are largely the product of their environment, and many of their characteristics, their fears and their neuroses, as well as their abilities, are conditioned by the impressions of what we may call their early childhood, unquote. It was a gloomy picture, one that offered little hope for future friendship between Russia and the West, unquote. For that last point, Kennan said as much in 1936 when he wrote that there was, quote, little future for Russian-American relations other than a long series of misunderstandings, disappointments, and recriminations on both sides, unquote. That was not really what Roosevelt wanted to hear. Kennan wrote reams and reams of notes advising Washington on how to deal with the Soviets, and for all of his trouble he gets mostly ignored. But he does get his day. His ideas find fertile soil in Washington very soon after the war. Bolin, for what it's worth, shares a lot of perspectives with Kennan, although he does differ slightly. Regardless, he too thought friendship with the Soviets was doomed to fail. As he wrote in 1938, quote, "The Kremlin does not envisage cordial relations with capitalist governments on any permanent basis, but rather as a temporary expedient," unquote. This was a prescient observation because the Soviet Union's political focus shifted from Britain and France to Germany. In fact, in 1939, Bolin was one of the first to find out about the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact and its secret provision about the partition of Poland. He shouldn't have found out about it. The Germans took an oath of secrecy at their embassy, but so much for that, I guess, because a German diplomat just straight up told him. This pact stunned the world, although maybe it shouldn't have been entirely unexpected. Stalin was an opportunistic kind of guy, and he didn't particularly see much difference between the Western powers. Sure, Germany was fascist, but fascism to him was just another flavour of capitalism. So between Paris, London and Berlin, when you get down to brass tacks, they were all his enemies. That being said, starting at the Poland Pact isn't the full story because he was dealing with France and Britain first. About a year-ish prior to Molotov-Ribbentrop, after Germany annexes Austria, Hitler starts eyeing the Sudetenland in Czechoslovakia. Now, if you remember when I talked about the pact between France and the Soviet Union, Czechoslovakia got involved in that too. This meant, theoretically, they had French and Soviet support. Practically, though, it didn't quite work out that way. The Czechs, in fairness to them, were willing to fight, and they asked around, saying, "Hey, is anyone going to come to our aid if war breaks out?" And the Soviets said yes. They even put their troops on standby. The thing is, the Soviets had a condition. The Soviets would help so long as the French went in first. As the treaty said, the French were not very enthusiastic about this. For one thing, the French and the British have serious World War I PTSD. I mean, a whole generation was just destroyed in the meat grinder of the Western Front. So the appetite for war was non-existent. The French also didn't think their military was ready, nor did they think the Soviet military was ready. Now, there was maybe some truth to that because Stalin had been decimating his officer corps with purges. Furthermore, even if Stalin was serious about his commitments to Czechoslovakia, it wasn't obvious how he was going to get his troops there. Poland wasn't going to allow Red Army troops to pass through their territory, and Romania, a possible alternative, was equally as resistant. Now, whether Stalin would have actually went if he could, I don't know. But the choice is taken out of his hands because war gets evaded for now with the infamous Munich Agreement, where the Germans, by the efforts of Chamberlain, are just given the territory, whether the Czechs like it or not, and they don't. They call it the Munich Betrayal. The Soviets had warned Poland not to go to war with Czechoslovakia, but the Poles on October 1st, 1938, gave an ultimatum to Czechoslovakia to hand over parts of Silesia that had a Polish ethnic presence. They end up getting the territory they want, it's just handed over, which meant a Soviet-Polish war was avoided. But as Stephen Kotkin writes, quote, "Still, the Soviets let it be known that the Poles were engaged in a dangerous game. There are more than 6 million Ukrainians and 2 million Belarusians in Poland," unquote. Now by this point, after the Munich Agreement, Stalin's foreign policy was diverse. He was reaching out with France and Britain, who were apprehensive about any solid military agreements with him. He had a Polish ambassador be told, quote, "No hand extended to the Soviets would be left hanging in the air," unquote. Even after they had pulled that stunt with Silesia. And among all that, he was also trying to reach out to the Germans. As is known, by mid-March 1939, the Germans take Czechoslovakia proper. Militarily, no one does anything about it. 5 days later, the Germans issue an ultimatum to Lithuania for its port and Memel. the Lithuanians handed over, war is averted again. Whilst the Germans shift their diplomatic focus to Poland in the aims of getting Danzig, the Soviets warned the Baltics, saying that if they were to make any agreements with another power, i.e. Germany, that diminished their own independence, the Soviets would find that unacceptable and there would be quote-unquote ensuing consequences. Thirdly, Chamberlain announces a guarantee of Poland. Now, some caveats to this. It's kind of half-hearted. It was assumed that Poland would still probably have to give up Danzig in the Polish corridor, but Poland's bargaining position might be improved with the guarantee all the same. Again, he was trying to avoid a war. Kotkin writes, quote, "Inside Whitehall, appeasement was far from dead. Even after the debacle of Czechoslovakia, when the British cabinet discussed a guarantee for Poland, its members agreed that it would be operative only if the Poles did not demonstrate, quote, provocative or stupid obstinacy, unquote, regarding Danzig and the corridor. The guarantee further required that the Poles themselves mobilise to fight the Germans, an action that London kept warning the Poles not to take. For all that, however, the guarantee had been publicly proclaimed. The nightmare Chamberlain had strenuously tried to avoid was now upon him, a possible second European-wide war," unquote. By April 1939, the Germans are ramping up military preparations to go into Poland. So the French and British gingerly reach out to the Soviets, seeing if they might make a declaration of support for any countries who were, quote, victims of aggression, unquote. They're talking about Poland. Interestingly, the Soviets return with an all-out offer, a plan for a triple alliance between Moscow, Paris and London to counter the Germans. It's edited by Stalin and all. He gave the go-ahead and it's passed on to the British and French. Kotkin writes, quote, "British officials internally judged the Soviet proposal, quote, extremely inconvenient, unquote, and hurriedly worked to douse French interest in it. The French contemplated an independent policy vis-a-vis Moscow, but only briefly," unquote. The British, having been handed a proposal that they didn't really want, but at the same time couldn't quite say no to because of the optics, found themselves having to stall. Stalin, though, was running out of patience. Dealings with the Western democracies was known as collective security, and it was the brainchild of Stalin's foreign affairs commissar, Litvinov. I mentioned him earlier. He was the guy who made that deal with the Americans. But this collective security, as far as Stalin was concerned, was worse than useless, and he'd taken to trashing the idea in his meetings with his minions. Litvinov, because it was him who was pursuing the policy, subsequently landed in Stalin's crosshairs. One onlooker from these meetings said, quote, "The atmosphere was strained to an extreme. Although outwardly Stalin appeared calm, puffing on his pipe, it was evident he was extremely ill-disposed toward Litvinov," unquote. The onlooker continued, quote, "Molotov became vicious, attacking Litvinov unremittingly, accusing him of every mortal sin," unquote. Molotov did not like Litvinov, and Litvinov's failed collective security project allowed Molotov to take his job, all while Litvinov gets placed under house arrest. Meanwhile, the Germans lowered their anti-communist rhetoric while also denouncing their Polish non-aggression pact. They now started to be more receptive to negotiations with the Soviets. Rapprochement was perhaps on the horizon. But at the same time, you didn't really know. I mean, the dealings going on in the background were unreal. Germany obviously was at the epicenter, but while they were maybe going to cozy up to Stalin, it could also just be a bluff to scare the Polish, or for that matter, the British. The Germans were also trying to rope the Italians and the Japanese into an official anti-Soviet military alliance, rather than just a in-name only kind of alliance. The Japanese, who were keeping tabs on what was happening in Europe, were split because their military favours going into the Soviets' Far East, but their navy wants to attack south into the southern colonies, drawing them into a conflict with the Americans, the British and the French, perhaps. While they're already in a land war in China, I should add, a war they're being butchers in, but are nonetheless struggling with. The Soviets, more specifically Stalin, have a deep-rooted existential fear of a multinational military alliance against them. They also don't know exactly how that alliance would manifest, because while it's safe to say that Germany would probably be a member, who its allies would be is in question, because while it might be the Italians and the Japanese, it could also be the French or the British, or in a total nightmare scenario, all of them combined. So Stalin doesn't want to tell the British and French to kick rocks just yet, because he doesn't have anything solid with the Germans. On May 8th, 1939, Molotov meets with the French and British ambassadors and says that the offer of collective security still stands. The British and French, though, were still being coy about any actual military alliance, which annoyed Molotov. The Brits, having guaranteed Poland and Romania, wanted the Soviets to publicly declare support about that, but didn't mention anything what would happen if the Soviets themselves got attacked. Molotov wrote in a telegram to the Soviet ambassadors in London and Paris, quote, "As you see, the English and French are demanding of us unilateral and gratuitous assistance, with no intention of rendering us equivalent assistance," unquote. The British also wouldn't make any guarantees for the Baltic states, which the Soviet Union really wanted because it felt it could get attacked through there. The Polish, even, for a brief moment in early May, extended a diplomatic hand to the Soviets for its protection, before immediately changing its mind and getting into a signed military pact with France. Molotov immediately demands from the British the same thing, but again, he wanted guarantee agreements for the Baltics, but the Baltics did not want to be guaranteed by the Soviets, which the British knew. The British were also cognizant of the fact that the Polish and Romanians might have the same concern, because if you allow Red Army troops in your territory, it's not clear how you're going to be able to get them out of there again. As Halifax had written about the Polish, quote, "An intelligent rabbit would hardly be expected to welcome the protection of an animal 10 times its size, whom it credited with the habits of a boa constrictor," unquote. Such was the plight of the Soviets. Absolutely nobody trusted them. But Stalin was hearing things from Germany that indicated that their plan was to smash Poland as quickly as possible and then turn west to fight France and Britain, which meant, potentially, Stalin was safe for now, because the Germans could never do that unless they came to an understanding with the Soviet Union first. But again, nothing solid was emerging from either Germany, France, or Britain. The diplomatic talks were painfully slow. By June, problems with the Baltics emerged again. Estonia and Latvia signed a non-aggression pact with Germany, with Estonia getting further visits from German officials. The Soviets freak out about this, demanding Estonia to pull back from the Germans. Meanwhile, Molotov keeps trying to push the British for a guaranteed deal on the Baltics, and he's getting nowhere fast. Molotov writes in a telegram to his colleagues that the British and French, quote, "do not want a serious agreement based on the principle of reciprocity and the equality of conditions," unquote. Some within London urged Chamberlain to just take the deal, even though it could end up being another appeasement situation, but Chamberlain doesn't want to take the chance. As he wrote a few weeks later in a private letter to his sister, quote, "I am so sceptical of the value of Russian help that I should not feel our position was greatly worsened if we had to do without them," unquote. Kotkin writes in relation to the British reluctance, quote, "Stalin was stupefied. The British imperialists had seized 1/4 of the earth across oceans, and yet they kept invoking principle in a refusal to allow him to protect himself in connection with microscopic territories contiguous with the Soviet homeland that, until recently, had belonged to Russia and that represented a threat," unquote. The antics of the Anglo-Saxons seem to preoccupy Stalin's mind, because Kotkin writes about a remarkable situation that occurred. He writes, quote, "Around this time, at a grand Kremlin palace reception, the dancer, Igor Moiseev, whose folk ensemble had become among the most popular acts, was talking to Voroshilov. Stalin cherished their number, Moscow Regional Lyrical, from the dance cycle Pictures from the Past, and, as the defense commissar asked what Moiseev planned to stage next, Stalin approached. Apprised of the conversation, he said, quote, 'All the same, they will never stage what Stalin needs,' unquote, to which Moiseev replied, 'Yosef Vissarionovich, do you have a bad opinion of us?' To which Stalin replied, 'Not at all, but what Stalin needs, you will not stage. For example, will you stage the rout of England and France?' Kotkin ends, 'Silence ensued. Faces froze. Stalin moved on,' unquote. As more time passed and still no agreements reached, Stalin was getting even more tired of the British. There was news coming out that there were offers of bribes from London to Berlin to prevent war. There was also an agreement with the Japanese that the British signed on July 24th called the Tencin Agreement, which protected British holdings in a city in China that were being blockaded by the Japanese. The British couldn't really do anything about it. The Royal Navy was far away, and anyways, there was more pressing issues in Europe. But to Stalin, this was just evidence that the British were not that committed to opposing aggression, especially that of the Japanese kind, which is important to Stalin because he's currently fighting a border war with them. Nevertheless, the British finally agree to open up official military talks in late July. But at the same time, the Germans make an offer. See, as much as they don't like the idea, they need Soviet resources and Soviet neutrality. And Molotov had told them that for the latter, there'd need to be a trade agreement first, which also suits the Soviets. And so the Germans, by late July, say, okay, we can maybe make a deal. And to sweeten it, they say that the question of the Baltics could even be up for discussion. As Ribbentrop told the Soviet ambassador to Berlin, quote, "From the Baltic to the Black Sea, there was no problem which could not be solved to our mutual satisfaction," unquote. As I mentioned a minute ago, Britain and France were willing to finally talk seriously about a military agreement. At least supposedly, the representatives they were sending to Moscow were not all that reassuring to the Soviets. Kotkin writes, quote, "When the Western ambassadors informed Molotov who would be coming, he evidently launched a tirade, then stormed out of his own office," unquote. At the same time, Stalin is hearing from an underling who was himself informed by a spy the Soviets had in MI6 some unsettling information about the British. He's told, quote, "The British chiefs of staff are firmly convinced that war with Germany can be won without difficulty, and therefore the British government has no need to conclude a defence pact with the Soviet Union. In government circles, the opinion expressed is that England never thought about concluding a pact with the USSR. The Prime Minister's advisors say openly that Great Britain can do without a Russian pact," unquote. He's also told information coming from a different source that for London, quote, "It is a fundamental policy to work with Germany whatever happens, and, in the end, against the USSR, but it is impossible to conduct this policy openly," unquote. Stalin's underling says that his source tells him that London's aim, quote, "is not to resist German expansion to the east," unquote. The British and French representatives that are sent to Moscow to have military talks aren't sent by plane, like you might imagine they ought to be. They're put on a ship, and not even a particularly fast ship. You know, for supposed important, and one might say urgent, military negotiations, they pick a horrendously inefficient way of getting to Moscow. And the reasons for doing so aren't particularly convincing. They could have gone on the spacious British bombers, but apparently those were uncomfortable. When they finally get to Moscow on the 11th of August, the Frenchman doesn't have any written authority to sign any agreements, and the Englishman doesn't have any documents to authorize him to even negotiate in the first place. Now, Stalin by this point has lost all interest in the British, and the Germans, who are meant to be going to war soon, potentially by the end of the month even, are anxious for a Soviet response. On the 12th of August, they get one. The Soviets agree to formal negotiations so long as they take place in Moscow. After some ironing out of the details, they first signed an economic agreement on the 20th of August, which meant the Germans would get grain, oil and raw materials, and the Soviets would be able to get technology. This economic agreement paves the way for the non-aggression pact, which Germany really wants because they're going into Poland soon. And finally, Stalin, after kind of getting hassled by Hitler a little bit over letters, finally says Ribbentrop can come to Moscow on the 23rd of August. Now, I gave slack to the British and French for going by boat, but the Germans send Ribbentrop in a top-of-the-line airplane, and Stalin, I kid you not, didn't inform his border guards that Ribbentrop was coming. So the border guards just see a plane violating their airspace and they try to shoot it down. They miss. Ribbentrop gets to Moscow safely, but it's a close call nonetheless. In regards to the pact, because the Germans have their invasion date set so soon, Stalin basically holds all the power. He can ask for whatever he wants. The Germans don't even try to argue with him. The final deal gives him about half of Poland, German disinterest in Romania's Bessarabia, and a sphere of interest in the Baltics and Finland. With the official signing on August 24th, 1939, congratulations were had all around. As one German observer wrote, quote, "The atmosphere, which had been pleasant, became warmly convivial. The ruler of Russia filled his guests' glasses himself, offered them cigarettes, and even to light them." Unquote. Around this same time, the Soviets give the Japanese a bloody good hiding in the Far East, thanks in no small part to the genius of Georgy Zhukov. Zhukov handles the border war masterfully, and from the perspective of the Japanese, not only do they lose the border war, but their supposed allies in Germany just sign a pact with the country they lost the border war to. The Prime Minister of Japan called the pact, quote, "intricate and baffling," unquote. The British and French are no less disturbed, and the international communist movement itself has to do some soul searching to find sense in it. Keep in mind, many communists volunteered to fight in the Spanish Civil War against the very people who the Soviets were now shaking hands with. They spent most of the 30s trying to build up a political united front against them, but as far as Stalin is concerned, he got the deal of his life. He gets free hand in Poland, the Baltics, and Finland, and gets to stay out of the European war. So while some communists are upset that he made a deal with enemy number one, in Stalin's Marxist geopolitical calculations, the European war is going to weaken all of his enemies. As he said, quote, "We see nothing wrong in their having a good fight and weakening each other. It would be fine if at the hands of Germany, the position of the richest capitalist countries were shaken," unquote. Now, it's worth mentioning that the last time a European-wide war happened, it was a bloodbath that lasted years, which Germany lost, but no one really won. And so in 1939, this was the lens Stalin was looking through. France had on paper a powerful army that could stand up to the Germans, and so there was reason to believe that a prolonged war of attrition was on the horizon. The twist of fate is that there would be one, just not with France. On September 1st, 1939, the Germans march into Poland, with the Soviets following soon after when they think it's safe to do so. The Germans actually go past their agreed line, which leads to brief skirmishes between the Germans and Soviets, leading to actual casualties. But things cool down, the Germans move back, and the pact, as shaky as it is, holds. The Germans, though, barely conceal their contempt for the Soviets. At one point they send footage of the invasion to Moscow and say that, Stalin should take the film and show it all over the Soviet Union. To which Stalin agreed if the Germans would show a Soviet film to their audience. And the Germans obviously refused. They had no intention of doing that, they just wanted to gloat. But Nikita Khrushchev, who later became leader of the USSR, wrote about this. He said, quote, "Nevertheless, this film was sent to us by the Germans and we took a look at it together with Stalin. It really did have a depressing effect, especially on the people who assumed that those same weapons would soon be turned against them," unquote. With the invasion of Poland, so commences World War II. But not for the Soviets. Not yet. Stalin has about 2 years before the Wehrmacht makes its march to Moscow. So here's what he does in the meantime. Stalin rejigs the pact with Germany to trade some of Poland for more of the Baltics. Then, in regards to Poland, he cements Soviet control. Oleg Klivniuk in his Stalin biography writes, quote, "For the first year and a half of their Sovietization, the new territories underwent the same violent social engineering that the USSR had been experiencing for decades. The goal was to force them into the Soviet mold, to do away with the capitalist economic system, inculcate a new ideology, and destroy any real or imagined hotbeds of dissent against the regime. The traditional methods were used. Suspicious people were shot, sent to labor camps, or exiled to the Soviet interior. Private property was expropriated, and farming was brought into the kolkhoz system. The Stalinist regime was trying to eliminate in just months any potential for anti-Soviet collaboration," unquote. One particular instance included the murder of 21,000 Polish officers and intellectuals, which the Soviets afterwards denied for years, and the Western Allies try not to mention that much during the war. In regards to the Baltics, they get strong-armed into accepting guarantees and Soviet military bases before eventually just getting outright annexed. And in regards to Finland, after watching the Baltics suspiciously accept Soviet military bases, they become very wary of Soviet propositions for discussions on, quote, concrete political matters, unquote. They up their military readiness, calling up reserves, that kind of thing. But the Finns are in a tough spot because no one really wants to help them. The Germans have already washed their hands of them, and the British are also disinterested. Stephen Kotkin writes, quote, Finland's government was consulting separately with London and Berlin. The Germans bluntly advised acceptance of any Soviet proposal. The British, in talks with the Finns, mostly pooh-poohed the likelihood of a Soviet aggression. Reporting out of Helsinki, a few British Foreign Office personnel reasoned that a Finnish decision to take up arms against the USSR would be advantageous to the UK, since a war would consume Soviet petroleum, grain, and war materials that otherwise might be shipped to Germany, and could even precipitate that most desirable outcome of all, a Soviet-German clash. This cynicism came with only offers of moral support to the Finns. Winston Churchill, newly appointed First Lord of the Admiralty, flat out told Maesky, the Soviet envoy to London, on October 6, 1939, that he understood, quote, well that the Soviet Union must be the master of the eastern coast of the Baltic Sea, unquote, and added, quote, Stalin is now playing the great game and very successfully, unquote. This was the same Churchill who, in 1919 to 1920, had schemed with Mannerheim, albeit unsuccessfully, to mount an offensive spearheaded by Finnish troops to topple the Bolshevik regime. Now desperately wanting to keep all of Scandinavia out of the clutches of Nazi Germany, Churchill told Maesky that if Estonia and Latvia were to lose their sovereignty, he would be quote-unquote very glad if it were to the Soviet and not the German sphere, unquote. So the Finnish, with not a lot of options, agree to talks. Now, the Soviets want essentially military bases on Finland's coast and for the Soviet-Finnish borders to be pushed up a bit, though in return for the land near Leningrad, the Soviets would trade land further north to the Finnish in a kind of a swap. The Finnish refused that deal, annoying Stalin greatly, who was meant to have said to the Finns, quote, we cannot do anything about geography, nor can you. Since Leningrad cannot be moved, the frontier must be moved farther away. We ask for 1,000 square miles and we offer more than 2,120 in exchange. Would any other great power do this? No, only we're that stupid, unquote. Moscow's arguments are unconvincing to a Soviet-wary Finland, and when diplomacy fails, Stalin takes his ill-prepared Red Army and moves in on November 30th, 1939, commencing what is known as the Winter War. The Soviets get kicked out of the League of Nations for it and draw condemnation from the US. Now the Soviets win the war, technically speaking, although the Finns inflict grievous injuries to the Red Army. To give you an idea of how grievous, in just 3 months of fighting, the Soviets suffered over 300,000 casualties. The Finns take about 70,000 casualties, and the war ends when the Finns sue for peace. They have to make concessions, but on the bright side, they remain independent. The Soviets, even though they had to pay a high price for them, learned important military lessons during the war. A re-emphasis on mechanization was one such lesson. The usefulness of submachine guns were another, surprisingly enough. The Finns used submachine guns with devastating effectiveness, and after the Winter War, the Soviets recognized the wisdom in it and ramp up their own production, eventually leading to the PPSH, a beast of a weapon, and I don't mind saying so. Anyways, international onlookers watched Soviet performance in Finland and came away unimpressed, especially if you compare it to the German performance in France. The Wehrmacht smashes the Western Front, and by June 14th, German boots march on Parisian soil, and the French surrender soon after. It took the Germans less than 6 weeks to break the back of the French. Any notion of a prolonged World War I type conflict in the West evaporates before Stalin's very eyes, and this worries him real bad. Khrushchev again writes, quote, Stalin was very quick-tempered and irritable at that time. I had rarely seen him like that. At meetings, he hardly ever sat down in his chair but constantly paced. Now, he literally ran around the room and cursed like a longshoreman. He cursed the French and cursed the British, asking how they could have let Hitler smash them like that, unquote. Stephen Cochrane points out though that it's worth remembering he helped them do it. Stalin was exporting every resource under the sun, and the Germans, knowing the supplies were coming, happily spent their strength smashing France because whatever they used up was just going to get replaced anyways. The French and British were cognizant of German-Soviet trade, and seeing the Soviets and the Germans as essentially on the same team, they were going to strike the Soviet Union where they thought it would hurt most, in a plan they didn't end up doing, but a plan labelled Operation Pike that entailed bombing the Soviet oil fields in the Caucasus. They even sent up reconnaissance aircraft to scout the area, but with the fall of France, the notion was scrapped. It's worth noting, by the way, that strategic bombing was inaccurate at the best of times, but even if they destroyed the Soviet oil fields, most of Germany's oil was coming from Romania anyways, so, could have been a very costly mistake. By late 1940, Germany, for all intents and purposes, has hegemony over Europe. They're occupying Norway, Poland, the Low Countries and France. Italy's allied with them, with Hungary and Romania soon to follow. Of course, the Soviets congratulate the Germans on their victories, but they are troubled because they're fairly sure they're going to be in the crosshairs next. They just don't know when, but they don't think it's imminent. After the fall of France, Stalin annexed Bessarabia from Romania, which the pact didn't disallow, but they also took northern Bukovina, which they weren't meant to, and the Germans don't like that one bit, nor, naturally enough, do the Romanians. It's worth keeping in mind that, Stalin's actions there and in Finland pushed those countries further to the Germans. Again, no one trusts the Soviets. However, out west, Great Britain is looking an awful lot lonelier there on our island. The Germans assume they'll just surrender. I mean, it seems insane not to, given the fairly dire situation they find themselves in. But remember who's Prime Minister in late 1940? Winston Churchill, a guy who's admittedly a hardcore imperialist, but one who's nonetheless committed to defeating Germany. So committed, in fact, that he bombs French ships in the Mediterranean so that the Germans don't get them. It killed Frenchmen, more than 1,000 of them who, remember, weeks prior had been his allies. I'm not here to weigh the morality of the situation. I'm just saying that Churchill was not playing around. He was all in. Outside that, the problem Mr. Churchill faces is how exactly German defeat is going to manifest. His two potential options are help from the Americans, who want nothing to do with European affairs, or, less ideally, help from the Soviets, who are less than receptive because they want to give Berlin absolutely no reason to justify a conflict. Early feelers from the British to Stalin aimed for just discouraging further Soviet trade to the Germans, but Stalin had some of these conversations taped and actually given to the Germans as a kind of sign of loyalty. As uncomfortable as German hegemony was for Stalin, his contempt for Britain was nearly limitless. And anyways, it made zero sense to him why he would suddenly save the British by picking a fight with the Wehrmacht, especially since he thought that the British were just going to sign a peace deal anyways and leave him high and dry. Kotkin writes, quote, Stalin's view on Britain and geopolitics bordered on incoherence. Steeped in Marxist-Leninism, he was given to dismissing the British, the world's number one arms exporters, as a supposed nation of shopkeepers, among the ultimate Marxist insults. Yet, he was also inclined to regard Britain as the arch-imperialist manipulating all world affairs. Germany, dominating nearly the entire continent, somehow still remained the victim of the Versailles Order, unquote. Berlin offers peace terms to London because, again, they assume the war's over and that the British should just shake hands. London, though, refuses, and Hitler assumes that the British are clinging onto hopes that they'll get some kind of deal with Stalin, even though Stalin wants nothing to do with London. The Germans plan an invasion of the British home islands, but it's not feasible for a whole lot of reasons, but the mighty British Navy is certainly one of them. The Germans also failed to get air superiority, and the whole plan is just postponed. However, Operation Barbarossa is also being considered. Operation Barbarossa, if you don't know, is the planned invasion of the Soviet Union, although it too gets postponed until 1941. And Stalin kind of hears about this, by the way. He's being told about German troop movement in Eastern Europe and how immediately after Germany's war with the UK, there'll be war with the USSR. Kotkin neatly summarises the geopolitical situation, writing, quote, "It was, in any case, passing strange. For decades, the Führer had been hammering the necessity of annihilating Bolshevism and following the siren call of Lebensraum in the East in an existential war. But now he was asserting that the way to defeat Britain was to attack the Soviets. Stalin felt secure because Britain was the one stuck doing the fighting against Nazi Germany. But the more Britain resisted Hitler, the more Hitler entertained an attack on the Soviet Union. And the more Soviet intelligence warned Stalin about Hitler's aggressive attitudes towards the USSR, the more Stalin suspected British efforts to embroil him in a war with Germany." Unquote. Few other things happened before the year's end. Northern Transylvania is absorbed by Hungary. German troops enter Finland, much to the Soviets' outrage. The Germans also occupy Romania to preserve the precious oil fields. The Tripartite Pact is signed between Germany, Japan and Italy that promised, quote, "to assist one another with all political, economic and military means when one of the three contracting powers is attacked," unquote. The Soviets are told by the Germans that this pact is more for the Americans than for them, and in fact, all the signatories want positive relations with the Soviet Union. Now, despite the Barbarossa plan, there was actually some truth to this. Japan was looking for a non-aggression pact from the USSR, and Ribbentrop, the German foreign minister, was also keen on nurturing Soviet friendship, basically trying to bring Moscow into the Axis. Molotov is invited to Berlin to meet Hitler and maybe improve the relationship, although I should note that before Molotov even arrives, Hitler writes down, quote, "Political discussions have been initiated with the aim of clarifying Russia's attitude for the time being. Irrespective of the result of these discussions, all preparations for the East, which have already been verbally ordered, will be continued," unquote. On November 12th, 1940, Molotov arrives, and Hitler and Molotov talk about the situation. Molotov had been tasked by Stalin in no uncertain terms to find out, what did this new order look like and what was the Soviet Union's role in it going to be. And Stalin, insisted on specifics, like where exactly did German sphere of influence end and the Soviets begin. The Germans, though, were being vague or just not talking Stalin's language. Both Germany and the Soviet Union had an interest in the Balkans, but the Germans had hoped to deflect Soviet interests down south, ideally towards India, which was a British holding, which was, really more beneficial towards Germany than it was for the Soviet Union. The Germans had bragged about how close Britain was to surrendering, which led to an amusing situation where, during an air raid on Berlin, Ribbentrop had brought Molotov down to a shelter while talking about a possible four-way pact between Germany, Japan, Italy and the USSR. And Molotov was saying, well, before we talk about any pact, we need to understand where our interests lie in regards to Europe. And Ribbentrop kept talking about, how the British Empire will soon capitulate, to which, Molotov supposedly retorts, quote, "If England is defeated, why are we sitting in this shelter? And whose bombs are dropping so close that we can hear the explosions even here?" Unquote. Suffice it to say, the trip achieved very little. Though Kotkin writes, quote, "Molotov's unplanned refuge in the Berlin bomb shelter, a result of British bombing raids, had evidently helped solidify his view that Germany was still deeply mired in a war in the West, a circumstance that he interpreted in light of his conviction that no German leader would willingly launch a two-front war by attacking in the East. Even after his visit to Berlin in November 1940, Molotov continued to assert that Hitler would not attack," recalled Zhukov, who added that, quote, "One must take into account that in Stalin's eyes, in this case, Molotov had the added authority of someone who had personally visited Berlin," unquote. Now, despite the unproductive Berlin visit, The idea of the Soviet Union joining the Axis was not dead yet. Towards the end of 1940, Romania, Hungary and Slovakia officially signed the Tripartite Pact. And Italy gets embarrassed in Greece in a war they not only started, but didn't even tell the Germans they were going to start. The Soviets also make some diplomatic overtures to Bulgaria. In late November 1940, Stalin sends a guy called Arkady Sobolev to Bulgaria to meet with the Bulgarian Prime Minister and the King. The Bulgarians were given short notice, I should add, nor was Sobolev officially invited, but whatever. But the conversation essentially entailed getting permission for Red Army troops to pass through their territory towards the Turkish Straits should the Soviet Union need to get there. The Soviets promised not to interfere in Bulgaria's internal politics, and that if Bulgaria wanted, they could join the Tripartite Pact with Germany. In fact, they were told if Bulgaria did join that pact and agreed to allow Red Army troops through, the USSR would probably join the pact. The Bulgarians were apparently stunned. At that same time, Stalin was having his own meeting with a guy called Dimitrov in what's known as the little corner in the Kremlin. Kotkin explains, quote, "The main discussion concerned Bulgaria, Dimitrov's homeland. Quoting Stalin, historically, this is where the threat has always originated. The Crimean War, the taking of Sevastopol, Wrangel's intervention in 1919 and so forth." Stalin added that Sobolev had already been received in Sofia by Filov and that, quote, "In concluding a mutual assistance pact, we not only have no objections to Bulgaria's joining the Tripartite Pact, but we ourselves in that event will also join the pact," unquote. Stalin further indicated that he would seek to secure the Straits directly by pressuring Turkey. "What is Turkey?" he continued. "There are 2 million Georgians there, 1.5 million Armenians, 1 million Kurds, and so forth. The Turks amount to only 6 or 7 million, unquote. Amid the bluster, however, Stalin noted to Dimitrov, quote, "Our relations with Germany are polite on the surface, but there is serious friction between us," unquote. Despite the friction, Stalin was willing to join the pact. The thing was, he was pushing for a lot. Certainly more than the Germans were ever going to give him. He has Molotov give the Germans a list of Soviet prerequisites for joining. Here's what he was asking for. Germans leave Finland. A pact would be signed between the USSR and Bulgaria for Soviet security on the Black Sea. The Soviets would obtain a privileged position on the Turkish Straits and a, quote, "center of gravity," unquote, south from Batumi and Baku to the Persian Gulf. And lastly, Japan would renounce its oil and coal concessions in northern Sakhalin with reasonable economic compensation. The Germans ignore him. No response, which was a bad sign. In December, a month later, Hitler had made a secret directive which ordered that, quote, "Even before the end of the war with England, the German armed forces must be prepared to annihilate the Soviet Union in a swift campaign," unquote. Rumours, of course, were in constant circulation of a supposed attack, but there was one report in late December the Soviets took seriously. Soviet military intelligence get a report from one of their spies that confirms the rumour, and they forward that information to Stalin, writing that, quote, "From highly informed military circles, it has become known that Hitler issued an order to prepare a war against the USSR, and that the war will be declared in March of the coming year," unquote. The actual date was set for May, which would even be pushed back to June. Now, Germany's economy had been bolstered by its conquests, but it still relied on the Soviets' resources, which Stalin knew. So to highlight that point, he shut down exports in December 1940 and January 1941, which caused German exports to the USSR to skyrocket. They sign another economic pact in January 1941, and Hitler remarks on Stalin's stunt that, quote, "Stalin is intelligent, clever and cunning. He demands more and more. He's a cold-blooded blackmailer. A German victory has become unbearable for Russia. Therefore, she must be brought to her knees as soon as possible," unquote. Despite Stalin's economic strong-arming, and despite the propaganda that echoed in Germany that the Soviets were amassing troops at the border for a preemptive strike at any moment, Hitler didn't think Stalin was willing to hit first. He told his high command that, quote, As long as Stalin lives, the Russians will not attack, for Stalin is cautious and reasonable, unquote. In regards to the German build-up in the east, on Stalin's border, Stalin was led to believe at first they were just there to train for operations against the British, either on the home islands or on its empire. Later, it was thought that the Germans had them there as a kind of show of force for some kind of concessions they were trying to get, maybe. I mean, rumours and speculations were pelting the Soviet intelligence services, but to Stalin, a two-front war just seemed so unlikely. He was training his forces, just in case, but if Germans hadn't squared away the Western Front yet, where was the sense in going east? The answer that Stalin suspected, and was indeed nurtured by German disinformation, was that these rumours were a scheme by the British to put Stalin in the war. Stalin, according to Zhukov, would say, quote, "Don't you see, they are trying to frighten us with the Germans, and frighten the Germans with us, setting one against the other," unquote. Meanwhile, by March 1941, Roosevelt over in America is comfortably in his third term, and he manages to get the Lend-Lease Act passed. This meant essentially the British war effort would get supported by Uncle Sam, without Uncle Sam necessarily being in the war. Strictly speaking, the Americans were neutral, but they were being more neutral to some than others. There was a debate inside America that went on about whether the US should even get involved in European affairs. The policymakers, though, like Roosevelt, saw German hegemony on the continent as a threat to the US, despite the Atlantic. German hegemony would grow even further when, on the 25th of March, the Yugoslavians signed a tripartite pact, officially adding them to the Axis. Then, like 2 days later, the Yugoslavian government is overthrown by Serbs, and the Germans just say to hell with it and invade the place. They declare war on Greece as well, saving the Italians, and after a pretty stunning campaign by late April, both the Yugoslavians and the Greeks were conquered. German troops that were used in the Balkans were sent right back to Eastern Europe in preparation for Operation Barbarossa, of which the starting date was pushed back from May to June, late June even. When the Yugoslavians were about to be invaded, Churchill sent a letter to Stalin that read, quote, "I have sure information from a trusted agent that when the Germans thought they had Yugoslavia in the net, that is to say, after March 20th, they began to move 3 out of 5 panzer divisions from Romania to southern Poland. The moment they heard of the Serbian Revolution, this movement was countermanded. Your Excellency will appreciate the significance of these facts," unquote. Churchill was being slick here. He was trying to say that Germany was weaker than she looked, and that should Stalin see fit, he could put the pressure on. Stalin, of course, says without saying, "No thanks." By this point, the reports of a planned invasion of the USSR were everywhere. The British were saying it, the Americans were saying it, the Soviets even were seeing German aircraft violating their airspace. The thing is, the Soviets were A-OK with what they knew was German reconnaissance aircraft scoping out their facilities. Why, you might be asking? Well, because they want to show the Germans that, hey, we have the means to make war. They even invite German observers to see their weapons factories and aircraft. The point was to illustrate that they aren't as easy target as the Germans might think. The Germans, of course, have a very low opinion of the Red Army despite its size. The German army, in comparison, had this invincible aura surrounding them. To rally his troops a bit, Stalin makes a speech on May 5th to the graduates from various military academies in the USSR. And in the speech, he plays up the might of the Red Army and downplays the might of the German army. Now, apparently, a full transcript of this speech doesn't exist, so historians have had to piece it together from different sources. But this is what Kotkin wrote that Stalin said, quote, "Why was France defeated and Germany victorious?" he asked. "Is Germany really invincible? Why did Germany turn out to have a better army? This is a fact. What explains it?" Unquote. Germany, he answered, had rearmed with the latest technology and studied the new methods of war and the lessons of history. Quoting Stalin again, "The German army, having been soundly defeated in 1918, studied up," he explained. The German army's military doctrine advanced. The army rearmed with the newest technology. It studied the newest methods of conducting war, unquote. By contrast, he said, the previously victorious French got complacent. Stalin added one revealing observation, quoting Stalin. In 1870, the Germans smashed the French. Why? Because they fought on one front. The Germans suffered defeat in 1916 to 1917. Why? Because they fought on two fronts, unquote. Kotkin continues, Stalin insisted that the current German army was not invincible. Quoting Stalin, there are no invincible armies in the world. Germany started the war and initially did so under the slogans of liberation from the Versailles Peace. These slogans were popular, elicited support and sympathy from all those humiliated by Versailles. Now the German army has altered the slogan of liberation from Versailles to conquest. The German army will not be successful under a slogan of a war of conquest and annexation. While Napoleon conducted a war under slogans of liberation from serfdom, he elicited support, sympathy, had allies, success. When Napoleon switched to wars of conquest, he accumulated many enemies and suffered defeat. Stalin added, in military terms, there is nothing special about the German army, neither in tanks, artillery, nor aviation, unquote. Still, he concluded, quoting him again, any politician, any political figure who allows a feeling of self-satisfaction can succumb to surprise, like the catastrophe that befell France, unquote. In mid-May, high-ranking German official Rudolf Hess crashes in Scotland in an attempt to secure peace with the British. On his own volition, by the way. The Germans are furious, but Soviet intelligence report to Stalin that he had permission. Of course, as you can imagine, this is very damning evidence that Berlin and London are brokering some kind of deal. After the Hess flight, Zhukov and Timoshenko, being inspired by Stalin's speech at the start of May, presented to Stalin a plan for a preemptive strike against Germany that cut through Romania and into Poland. It came from a war plan that supposed that the Germans would attack first and then the Soviets would counterattack. But with rumours of war, the logic was, why wait for an initial attack in the first place? Zhukov wrote about Stalin's reaction to this, quote, when he heard about a preemptive strike against the German troops, he just boiled over. What, have you lost your mind? You want to provoke the Germans? Unquote. Apparently, Kotkin writes, Stalin's speech was merely to, quote, to encourage the people there so that they would think about victory and not about the invincibility of the German army, which is what the world's press is blaring on about, unquote. Zhukov recalled, so that's how our idea about a preemptive strike was buried, unquote. With informers practically screaming at Stalin that he's gonna get invaded, Stalin found himself almost paralysed. He was in a similar situation to what Chamberlain was in, so desperate to avoid a war that came to him anyways. He does secretly bring troops closer to the border under the guise of military exercise, but he doesn't want to mobilise too much because he's terrified that'll provoke the Germans. At the same time, he reasons that a two-front war for Germany is insane. A war with the Soviets would cut off trade for Germany, depriving it of necessary resources, and that, to Stalin, seemed illogical while the British were still in the war. Even if a war is bound to happen, when it was going to happen is in question. Of all the reports Stalin was getting, most of them got the date wrong, so it was hard to parse what was even true or not. If the Germans were set on war, it seemed logical that they'd at least make demands first, and with winter a few months away, the Soviets could maybe stall with diplomacy until the window of invasion had passed, giving him about another year to prepare. Of course, Stalin didn't have another year. On the 22nd of June 1941, 3 million Wehrmacht and 500,000 more Axis soldiers march into the Soviet Union, commencing a war of unimaginable barbarity. It eventually cements the US-UK-Soviet relationship, and I won't be covering the war. You'd need like another 10 hours to do it justice, so I'm going to step over it. But before I end this section and come back to Truman, there's a quote I want to read from Stalin, and it's from a speech he makes about 10 years before the invasion, and it's fascinating, I think. Bit of context with it, this speech takes place against the backdrop of breakneck collectivization and industrialization efforts, which the way it was being done was shaking the country and making people have second thoughts about it. Stalin says, quote, "It is sometimes asked whether it is not possible to slow down the tempo somewhat, to put a check on the movement. No, comrades, it is not possible. The tempo must not be reduced." He continues on a little later. "To slacken the tempo would mean falling behind, and those who fall behind get beaten. But we do not want to be beaten. No, we refuse to be beaten. One feature of the history of old Russia was the continual beatings she suffered because of her backwardness. She was beaten by the Mongol Khans. She was beaten by the Turkish Beys. She was beaten by the Swedish feudal lords. She was beaten by the Polish and Lithuanian gentry. She was beaten by the British and French capitalists. She was beaten by the Japanese barons. All beat her because of her backwardness, because of her military backwardness, cultural backwardness, political backwardness, industrial backwardness, agricultural backwardness. They beat her because it was profitable and could be done with impunity. You remember the words of the pre-revolutionary poet. You are poor and abundant, mighty and impotent, Mother Russia. Those gentlemen were quite familiar with the verses of the old poet. They beat her saying, you are abundant, so one can enrich oneself at your expense. They beat her saying, you are poor and impotent, so you can be beaten and plundered with impunity. Such is the law of the exploiters. To beat the backward and the weak. It is the jungle law of capitalism. You are backward, you are weak, therefore you are wrong. Hence, you can be beaten and enslaved. You are mighty, therefore you are right. Hence, we must be wary of you. That is why we must no longer lag behind. In the past, we had no fatherland, nor could we have had one. But now that we have overthrown capitalism, and the power is in our hands, in the hands of the people, we have a fatherland, and we will uphold its independence. Do you want our socialist fatherland to be beaten and to lose its independence? If you do not want this, you must put an end to its backwardness in the shortest possible time and develop a genuine Bolshevik tempo in building up its socialist economy. There is no other way. That is why Lenin said on the eve of the October Revolution, either perish or overtake and outstrip the advanced capitalist countries. We are 50 or 100 years behind the advanced countries. We must make good this distance in 10 years. Either we do it or we shall go under." Unquote. I've seen another translation there at the end that read, "or they will crush us," and that's crazy because he's basically on the money. That speech was in February 1931. Germany's invasion was in June 1941. There was another point where he allegedly kind of made the same remark about the post-war world. It comes from Gilles Malovin's conversations with Stalin, and it's not as official as a speech or anything. They're just having dinner, and Stalin makes the remarks in the company of the Yugoslavian communists, who he later falls out with, by the way. But I'll read what Gilles wrote, what Stalin said. Whether it's true, who knows, but it's an interesting low-stakes anecdote, so I'll read it anyways. Gilles wrote, quote, "Stalin presented his views on the distinctive nature of the war that was being waged. Quoting Stalin, "This war is not as in the past. Whoever occupies a territory also imposes his own social system. Everyone imposes his own social system as far as his army has power to do so. It cannot be otherwise." Unquote. Gilles continues, he also pointed out, without going into long explanations, the meaning of his pan-Slavic policy. Quoting Stalin again, "If the Slavs keep united and maintain solidarity, no one in the future will be able to move a finger, not even a finger." Unquote. He repeated, emphasizing his thought by cleaving the air with his forefinger. Someone expressed doubt that the Germans would be able to recuperate within 50 years, but Stalin was of a different opinion. Quoting Stalin, "No, they will recover, and very quickly. It is a highly developed industrial country with an extremely skilled and numerous working class and technical intelligentsia. Give them 12 to 15 years and they'll be back on their feet again. And this is why the unity of the Slavs is important. But even apart from this, if the unity of the Slavs exists, no one will dare move a finger." Unquote. Gilles continues, "At one point, he got up, hitched up his trousers as though he was about to wrestle or box, and cried out emotionally, 'The war will soon be over. We shall recover in 15 or 20 years, and then we'll have another go at it." Unquote. There was something terrible in his words. A horrible war was still going on. Yet, there was something impressive too, about his realization of the path he had to take, the inevitability that faced the world in which he lived, and the movement that he headed. Unquote. Here's where I want to circle back around to what we were talking about at the start of the episode. In April 1945, with the death of Roosevelt and Truman's predicament, Harry Truman needs to be brought up to speed on the Soviets, who they are, what they're for, and what do you do about them. The Soviets had been making certain circles in Washington quite nervous for a while. As one State Department official wrote, quote, I can testify that there was no time when the danger from the Soviet Union was not a topic of anxious conversation among officers of the State Department, and by the winter of 1944 to 1945, as the day of victory approached, it became the predominant theme in Washington." Unquote. So Truman requests a report on the main US foreign policy issues from the State Department, who are only too glad to have his ear. Bolin ends up writing that report, which highlighted how difficult the Soviets were being, as well as shining a light on Poland. This will be a recurring theme, by the way. Poland is a particularly troublesome issue between the Western Allies and the Soviets, based on what kind of government is going to be there and whether there'll be free elections or not. You had two governments for Poland. You had the London Poles, which were the original government for Poland, and you had the Lublin Poles, which were their Soviet-gathered counterpart. Anyways, Truman, Bolin, and Stettinius meet in the Oval Office and, in Truman's words, quote, "plunged into the harassing question of Poland and the difficulties we were having with the Soviet leaders because of it," unquote. Now, this won't be the only meeting that goes on about the Soviets, because around at this point, Harriman is back in town from his time in Moscow, and he's armed with opinions. Pretty important opinions too. Remember, this guy is the ambassador to the Soviet Union, so his words carry some weight. So Bolin and Undersecretary of State Joseph Grew set up a meeting with all the head honchos of the State Department, and they invite Harriman to speak there. I'm going to summarize the main points. I'll link below if you want to read it, but it's interesting because it's the first drops of Soviet suspicion for America before the total anti-communist hysteria of the Cold War later. Harriman says, quote, "It was fair to say that since the Crimean Conference, the Russians have been greatly disturbed by the fact that for the first time they realized that we were determined to carry through what we said, i.e. in regards to Poland and the Liberated Areas Declaration. We have always dealt directly and fairly and with full candor. This the Russians, accustomed to an atmosphere of suspicion and intrigue, do not understand. They have undoubtedly viewed our attitude as a sign of weakness." Unquote. Harriman points out that the Soviets do not like the prospect of a shared government in Poland because they think the Soviet-backed Poles would be unpopular, ultimately weakening their influence over the country. Harriman says he, quote, "felt the time had come to eliminate fear in our dealings with the Soviet Union and to show we are determined to maintain our position." Unquote. Continuing, quote, "One point worth remembering was that the Soviet Union wants very much to be a respected member of world society." Unquote. As a result, Harriman points out that the Soviets, above all, fear a quote-unquote united West, and that, quote, "our relations with the Soviets would be vastly improved if we could settle our differences with Great Britain and France." Unquote. Harriman was asked exactly how much the Soviets were afraid of being isolated, to which he answered that the Soviets, quote, "main problem is keeping internal control. The people were most anxious to have friendly relations with the outside world, particularly with the United States. While they have liquidated all opposition, they are still sensitive to public demands, and Mr. Harriman doubted that they would be willing to face a break with the United States." Unquote. Further on he says, quote, "The basic and irreconcilable difference of objective between the Soviet Union and the United States," Mr. Harriman said, "was its urge for its own security to see Soviet concepts extended to as large an area of the world as possible. This now arises in connection with their plans to establish friendly governments in bordering countries, e.g. Romania, Bulgaria and Poland, with Finland temporarily the exception. Such governments are set up with Soviet assistance by leftist groups using secret police and other terroristic and undemocratic methods." Unquote. The memorandum continues, quote, "Mr. Harriman expressed the opinion that the Soviet Union, once it had control of bordering areas, would attempt to penetrate the next adjacent countries, and he thought the issue ought to be fought out insofar as we could with the Soviet Union in the present bordering areas." Unquote. When asked what America ought to do about all this, Harriman says, "It depends on each case." Quote, "For instance, if we joined the British in backing the present reactionary government in Iran, we would lose out. Each case would have to be studied individually. But," Mr. Harriman said, "we must re-establish our respect in Moscow, and we must not tolerate Russian mistreatment of our people and disregard of our interests." Unquote. Harriman emphasized that, quote, "we ought to take, at the present time, strong stands on minor points first, to avoid giving the Russians the idea we had made a major change in policy." Unquote. On Poland, Harriman concludes, quote, "we should not recede from our position." Unquote. Now, after this meeting, and I mean literally right after, Harriman goes to speak with the president himself. And honestly, he's even harsher sounding in this meeting. Truman had never met Harriman before, but he'd also never met a Soviet. Molotov, amusingly, will be the first one he does meet. But Truman had been reading, including stuff written by Harriman, which was quite a nice surprise as far as Harriman was concerned. He was quite flattered by it. So Truman, even this early in his presidency, was already getting the gist of the situation with the Soviets. But he asks Harriman about it all the same, and Harriman does not mince his words. Harriman said, quote, "The Soviet Union had two policies which they thought they could successfully pursue at the same time. One, the policy of cooperation with the United States and Great Britain, and the other, the extension of Soviet control over neighbouring states through unilateral action." He said that he thought our generosity and desire to cooperate was being misinterpreted in Moscow by certain elements around Stalin as an indication that the Soviet government could do anything that it wished without having any trouble with the United States. He said that he thought the Soviet government did not wish to break with the United States since they needed our help to reduce the burden of reconstruction, and that he felt we had nothing to lose by standing firm on issues that were of real importance to us. Truman responded that he, quote, "was not in any sense afraid of the Russians, and that he intended to be firm but fair, since in his opinion the Soviet Union needed us more than we needed them," unquote. Harriman said that the Soviets assumed American business, quote, "needed as a matter of life and death the development of exports to Russia." Mr. Harriman said that this was of course not true, but that a number of Russian officials believed it, unquote. Truman again responded with the attitude of being firm but fair, that he intended to make no concessions just to win Soviet favour. Harriman comes back to say that, quote, "in effect, what we were faced with was a barbarian invasion of Europe. That Soviet control over any foreign country did not mean merely influence on their foreign relations, but the extension of the Soviet system with secret police, extinction of freedom of speech, etc., and that we had to decide what should be our attitude in the face of these unpleasant facts," unquote. Although Harriman was also being pragmatic here, he said that, quote, "he was not pessimistic and felt that we could arrive at a workable basis with the Russians, but that this would require reconsideration of our policy and the abandonment of the illusion that for the immediate future the Soviet government was going to act in accordance with the principles which the rest of the world held to in international affairs," unquote. Both Harriman and the president understood that some concessions would be necessary, but that on important matters, Truman said, quote, "we should be able to get 85%, unquote. Harriman again explained the Polish issue and the Soviets' fears with it, before finally asking Truman what would happen if the Russians drop out of the UN, to which Truman replied there wouldn't be much of a UN without them. By the 23rd of April 1945, Molotov was in America. He and Truman did meet briefly, and it was pretty cordial, but the more official talk was yet to take place. So Truman gathers all his advisors to the White House to basically prepare for the proper meeting with Molotov. Truman gets told by Secretary Stettinius that the Soviets still hadn't budged on the Poland issue. They insisted on having a veto over any Poles in cabinet. Truman, being influenced by Harriman and his cables, considered US-Soviet relations so far as being, quote, "a one-way street," unquote, and said that if the Soviets didn't want to cooperate, they could, quote, "go to hell," unquote. But here's the thing. Among Truman's advisors, not everyone was totally on the same page on what to do, because you had different guys from different backgrounds saying different things. For example, Stimson, the Secretary of War, spoke first, and he was a bit more cautious. He was no fan of the Kremlin and did advocate for being firmer, but he considered that control over Poland was a legitimate concern for the Soviet Union and that it might be dangerous to have a confrontation over it. He said, quote, "the Russians perhaps were being more realistic about their own security than we were," unquote. General Marshall agreed with this, really out of practical concerns, because he wanted the Soviets to join the war against Japan. If you started pressing the Soviets too hard, they could start dragging their heels about joining the war until, in the general's words, quote, "until we have done all the dirty work," unquote. Navy Secretary James Forrestal was the most hawkish. He'd been fired up from talking to Harriman, and he pushed for a harder line, saying, quote, If the Russians were to be rigid in their attitude, we had better have a showdown with them now than later, unquote. Harriman also speaks, and his main point is that the Soviets wouldn't allow free elections because it'd lead to the defeat of their, quote, hand-picked group, unquote. And so the question now was if the US, quote, should be a party to a program of Soviet domination of Poland, unquote. After this meeting, Stimson and the military men left, but Harriman, Bolin, and Stettinius stuck around. Finally, Molotov shows up. Now the story goes that Truman gave him a harsh talking to about not keeping their agreements, and that Molotov leaves saying, quote, I've never been talked to like that in my life, unquote. To which Truman supposedly replies, quote, carry out your agreements and you won't get talked to like that, unquote. Now I believe the conversation was confrontational, but it's the last quote there that's worth talking about. You'll see this quote cited all the time, and I find it somewhat suspicious. Truman says this is what was said in his memoirs, but Truman says a lot of things, and anyways, Bolin doesn't even mention it during his memorandum. Apparently, the Soviets didn't mention it in their memorandum either, so who knows. Although for what it's worth, in Molotov's memoirs, he does touch on this meeting. Now, some things to say here. Molotov's memoirs aren't the traditional written memoirs. It's more of a series of interviews which were then put to page over the span of years, so it's very noticeably disjointed. If you've read it, you know what I mean. Another thing, like any memoir, you really got to take it with a grain of salt because, one, Molotov was an incredibly ideological guy, a Stalinist through and through, and he remained that way till the day he died. Even when it wasn't that fashionable to be a Stalinist in the Soviet Union anymore, he was still holding that flag. But also, two, he's remembering events from like sometimes 30 plus years in the past. So keep that in mind. But otherwise, the memoir is an absolutely fascinating read, especially when you pair it with Khrushchev's memoirs, which are also captivating if you allow for some caveats, and we'll touch on that again eventually. Also, and I have to mention this, Molotov outlived almost everyone in this video. Lenin, Stalin, Churchill, Truman, Harriman, Bolin, Attlee, Zhukov, Khrushchev, you name them. Molotov probably survived them. The one guy who he didn't outlive was Kennan, who died in 2005, which is wild. Anyways, on the meeting with Truman, Molotov said this, quote, at our first meeting with Truman, he began talking to me in such an imperious tone. Just before that, I had a discussion on the Polish question with Harriman and the British ambassador Clark Kerr in Moscow, how to form a government there. We wanted it formed by the National Committee of Poland. They pressed Mikhalchik on us in every possible way. And Truman said, why do you frame the question in such a way that we cannot agree with you? It's intolerable. I thought, what kind of president is he? Rather stupid to my mind, and he had a very anti-Soviet mindset. That's why he began in that tone. He wanted to show who was boss. Then he began to talk with us more respectfully and calmly. He talked modestly about himself, and Molotov impersonating Truman in quotations here, there are millions like me in America, but I am the president, unquote. He continues, he played the piano, nothing special of course, but not badly. He was far from having Roosevelt's intellect. A big difference. They had only one thing in common. Roosevelt had been an inveterate imperialist too, unquote. Now, for the Americans, the tone had been set, but they weren't trying to totally abandon Roosevelt's idea of a kind of peaceful coexistence. Truman, even though he was an anti-communist, was way too new and insecure a president to do something that brash that early. But the fact of the matter was, the Americans and the Soviets both had an interest in Poland, and sooner or later, this kind of talk was bound to take place. It's just that Roosevelt would have probably been slicker about it. As Bolin later wrote, quote, Roosevelt's technique would have been different. His approach would have been possibly more diplomatic and somewhat smoother. But he was in no mood the last time I saw him, only days before he died, to take further violations of the Yalta Accord lying down, unquote. As far as Stalin was concerned though, Poland was of utmost priority. As he said at Yalta, quote, for the Russian people, the question of Poland is not only a question of honour, but also a question of security. Throughout history, Poland has been the corridor through which the enemy has passed into Russia. Twice in the last 30 years, our enemies, the Germans, have passed through the corridor. Poland is not only a question of honour, but of life and death for the Soviet Union, unquote. Another quote I quite like is from the book Rise to Globalism, where historian Stephen E. Ambrose talks about the Soviets' incredulity at the Americans' interest in Poland. He writes, quote, "The Russians were puzzled as well as upset. As Stalin indicated on April 24th in a letter to Churchill and Truman, quote, Poland borders on the Soviet Union, which cannot be said about Great Britain or the USA," he began. Turning to complaints about the Soviet actions in Poland, he remarked, quote, "I do not know whether a genuinely representative government has been established in Greece, or whether the Belgian government is a genuinely democratic one. But the Soviet Union was not consulted when those governments were being formed, nor did it claim the right to interfere in those matters, because it realizes how important Belgium and Greece are to the security of Great Britain," unquote. He said he could not understand why in the West, quote, "no attempt is made to consider the interest of the Soviet Union in terms of security as well," unquote. US ideals of wanting a free and democratic Poland for the sake of freedom and democracy was not all that convincing to an increasingly suspicious Moscow, as historian Michael S. Nyberg points out in his Potsdam book. He writes, quote, "Western conduct during World War II did not strike the Russians as any more principled than the Mandate System agreements. The idealistic Atlantic Charter, issued by Roosevelt and Churchill in August 1941, seemed to fit right into the Wilsonian tradition. Although the Charter pledged to support national self-determination and a lowering of international trade barriers, American leaders made it clear that it would not interfere with American rights under the Monroe Doctrine to intervene in Latin America. Similarly, Churchill stated that the Charter did not apply to the British Empire. Such conditions made it impossible for the Russians to take the Charter and its ideals seriously. As a result, they never considered the Charter as a model for Soviet behavior in Eastern Europe or anywhere else. Allied policies during the war itself also seemed to undermine Western principles. If the West wanted to lecture Russia about its forced removal of suspected pro-German ethnic groups, such as the Tatars and the Chechens, the Russians could reply by citing the internment of Japanese Americans in US camps. If the British wanted to lecture Russia on its policies in Ukraine, the Russians could respond with allegations of British mistreatment of Bengal, where as many as 3 million Indians had died as a result of a famine, especially since the famine had been exacerbated by British policies that forced the export of Indian crops to the British Isles even in the midst of a worsening food crisis in India. Stalin rarely actually criticized Western policies, believing, as he did, that great powers involved in an existential war had the rights to do as they wished, especially in their own spheres of control. Nor did the Russians genuinely care about the fate of Japanese Americans or the Bengalis, but the apparent gap between the West's lofty ideals and its self-serving practices made the Russians extremely wary of pronouncements citing Western principles, which they saw not as real beliefs in the West, but rampant Western hypocrisy. The Russians had little interest in idealism, especially when it came from the intellectual inheritors of the hypocritical Wilsonian tradition. The evils of imperialism, the Soviets concluded, had caused both world wars, and Western ideology therefore threatened the future peace and stability in Europe. The Russians had little interest in basing the post-war world on the principles touted in the West. Even on matters of strategy, the Russians were quick to point out what they saw as Western double standards. When Western leaders expressed their reluctance to modify the international agreements that gave Turkey control over the Dardanelles, for example, Stalin objected. He proceeded to point out the hypocrisy of the Western position, given American control over the Panama Canal and British control over the Suez Canal. To Stalin, the three passages had much in common, as each served as a vital waterway for a great power but was surrounded by the sovereign territory of another state. American and British reluctance to consider revising the International Convention on the Dardanelles while keeping Panama and Suez under their exclusive control struck the Russians as the basis and most obvious kind of Western hypocrisy. It also provided further proof to them that the West did not follow its own ideals except when the Western ideals and Western interests overlapped, unquote. So, a few other things happen in the coming days. American and Soviet troops meet and embrace at the Elbe River in Germany. In the UN conference in San Francisco, US, Soviet and British delegates bicker and debate. Truman confirmed that there would be no negotiations with the Germans without Soviets present, which quite pleased Stalin. And in Washington, Truman finally gets a full explanation of the atomic bomb. Stimson had been really anxious to tell him. Truman had gotten some hints about it, but never a full explanation, never a briefing. Funnily enough, Truman became aware that something was up back in 1944 when he was a senator. He noticed some huge expenses that seemed inexplicable, which, by the way, were for the bomb. And when he asked about it, Stimson basically told him not to worry about it. Again, in Truman's memoirs, Truman writes that his reply to Stimson was, quote, "I'll take your word for it," unquote. However, in Stimson's diary, which he wrote at the time, he shows a rather different version of events. Stimson wrote, quote, "He threatened me with dire consequences. I told him I had to accept responsibility for those consequences. Truman is a nuisance and a petty, unworthy man. He talks smoothly and acts meanly," unquote. But times had changed and Truman needed to know. Stimson, who was accompanied by General Groves, the guy heading the Manhattan Project, really did not hold back in describing what kind of weapon this would be. In the first report he handed Truman, which Stimson typed himself, the first thing it said was, quote, "Within 4 months we shall, in all probability, have completed the most terrible weapon ever known in human history, one bomb of which could destroy a whole city," unquote. He pointed out that Russia would probably be able to make one in the next few years. He wrote a little further down, quote, "The world in its present state of moral advancement, compared with its technical development, would be eventually at the mercy of such a weapon. In other words, modern civilization might be completely destroyed," unquote. Stimson was understandably stark in his writing, speaking largely of the implications of the bomb, whereas Groves handled all the technicalities. But keep in mind, they also hadn't tested it yet. Not everyone was certain that it would work. Admiral Leahy, for example, had a very poorly aged quote when he said, quote, "The bomb will never go off, and I speak as an expert on explosives," unquote. By May 1945, Germany had surrendered and questions started to be raised about the post-war European continent and what it would look like. One pressing question was, of course, could everyone still get along with each other? Now, you get different pictures, of course, depending on how far you zoom in and how shortly after the surrender you zoom in at. For example, in the memoirs of the great Georgy Zhukov, he describes how jovial and full of friendship everyone was right after surrender. He writes, quote, "At 0 hours, 50 minutes, May 9th, 1945, the meeting at which the unconditional surrender of the German troops was signed came to a close. After that, a big reception was given. It passed off in an atmosphere of great enthusiasm. Opening the banquet, I toasted the victory of the anti-Hitler coalition over Nazi Germany. The next toast was given by Marshal Arthur Tedder. He was followed by de Latte de Tassigny and General Spatz. It was then the turn of the Soviet generals. Each spoke of what was in his heart after all these hard years. I remember people speaking sincerely and in the most heartfelt manner. A great desire was expressed to consolidate forever friendly relations between the countries of the anti-fascist coalition. This was stressed by the Soviet generals, by the Americans, the French, and the British, and all of us then wanted to believe it would be that way," unquote. However, it wasn't very long when suspicions started to creep in. The Soviets were going to have a military parade in Berlin, and they invited the heads of the other Allies to join. However, for whatever reason, the Western head officials couldn't make it, which the Soviets did not appreciate. Zhukov writes, quote, "But on the very eve of the parade, we were suddenly informed that, for a number of reasons, the commanders-in-chief of the Allied forces could not come to Berlin for the victory parade, and had authorized their generals to attend. I immediately put a telephone call through to Stalin. He heard my report and said, quote, they want to belittle the political importance of the parade of troops of anti-Hitler coalition countries. Just wait, they'll be up to something else next. Ignore the refusal of the Allies and take the salute yourself. All the more so, as we have more rights to do it than they," unquote. This wouldn't be the only spook the Soviets get about Western intentions. The Americans had been giving the other Allies Lend-Lease equipment for the war, and the Soviets hoped that might continue because their country badly needed to be built up again. But shortly after Germany's surrender, the Lend-Lease suddenly stops with no explanation, and the Soviets freak out about it. What actually happened was kind of an accident. Harriman had convinced Truman to cancel the Lend-Lease so that it'd motivate the Soviets to join the war with Japan sooner. And Truman ended up signing the order without reading it, which included recalling ships that were already out to sea. The Soviets were not informed of the change, and when the ships didn't turn up with the promised supplies, they naturally protested. Truman quickly reversed the order when Davies convinced him that it was a terrible idea, but the damage had been done. Davies and Truman, by the way, were old poker buddies, and the incident had made Truman skeptical of the State Department hardliners. When Davies visited Truman on the 13th of May, the two shared a drink and Truman talked about his personal struggles as president. He complained about the get tough advice from the State Department, as well as distortions from the, quote, damn newspapers. Davies gave his own advice to Truman, pulling out a letter which he'd written and not sent, and explained, quote, I have found that when approached with generosity and friendliness, the Soviets respond with even greater generosity. The tough approach induces a quick and sharp rejoinder that out-toughs anyone they consider hostile, unquote. At the end of the conversation, Truman admitted about being president, quote, it is a terrible responsibility and I am the last man fitted to handle it, unquote. Let's zoom out for a second. Since the war in Europe was over, the focus militarily for America shifted to Japan, and America was about to haul everything she could from Europe over to the Pacific to end the war as quickly as possible. This made sense, of course, but it stirred some anxieties, particularly with the British, and particularly with Churchill. Churchill and the British had found themselves in a rather precarious position. For one thing, they had no money, which I can't stress enough, the war absolutely bankrupted them. And another thing, their empire was falling apart. So they were coming into the post-war world in a serious position of weakness. London stopped being the financial centre of the world because under the Bretton Woods Agreement, suddenly American banks held all the power. The US dollar took its place as the world's currency, whether London liked it or not, and they sure grumbled, but they knew themselves they had no choice. They needed American financial support. John Maynard Keynes, who was an important economist at the time, half-joked that the British would actually benefit from a prolonged war with the Japanese because then, Americans would keep giving them aid. He wrote that he hoped, quote, the Japanese would not let us down by surrendering too soon, unquote. In the same light, there was a little song that circulated around the British Foreign Office in 1945, poking fun at the Americans that went something like, quote, in Washington, Lord Halifax once whispered to Lord Keynes, it's true they have all the money bags, but we have all the brains, unquote. So not only was London's financial power gone, but like I said, its very empire itself was at risk. India being the most obvious example, which was deemed the crown jewel of the empire and had long struggled for its independence, London, by 1945, had to seriously consider the prospects of losing India, which they eventually would. Even outside India, the empire had faced a serious loss of prestige from the Japanese blitzkrieg. The seemingly unbeatable Europeans got kicked from their colonies and kept out for quite a while in some places. A place like Singapore comes to mind, which was designed in the interwar years as this impenetrable fortress and was called the Gibraltar of the East. It was thought the Japanese could never take it, and then the Japanese took it. That loss had stung Churchill, by the way. He called it, quote, the worst disaster and largest capitulation in British history, unquote. His physician, a man called Lord Morn, shed some more light on Churchill's attitude to the situation, saying, quote, the fall of Singapore on February 15th stupefied the Prime Minister. How came 100,000 men, half of them of our own race, to hold up their hands to an inferior number of Japanese? Though his mind had been gradually prepared for its fall, the surrender of the fortress stunned him. He felt it was a disgrace. It left a scar in his mind. One evening, months later, when he was sitting in his bathroom enveloped in a towel, he stopped drying himself and gloomily surveyed the floor. I cannot get over Singapore, he said sadly, unquote. It wasn't only the British that lost out in Asia. The French and Dutch also faced similar circumstances, and the old Europeans were hoping that after Japan surrendered, they could maybe get their colonies back. The problem with this plan, of course, was that Asian nationalist sentiment had been supercharged during the European absence. The Japanese encouraged this somewhat with their talk of, quote, Asia for the Asiatics, unquote, and their Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere, which theoretically meant a mutually beneficial alliance, although in practical terms it meant subjugation. Japanese occupation was a horrendous affair, but it wouldn't last forever because the Americans, who were already winning the Pacific War, just finished their priority theatre in Europe, which freed up an awful lot of men and resources, and were about to be on a warpath east, where there wasn't an awful lot the Japanese could do to stop them. And so, the former colonies hoped that once the Japanese left, they would rule themselves, but the British, French and Dutch had other ideas. A popular slogan at the time among the Dutch had went something like, quote, "Disaster will be our cost if the Indies are lost," unquote. The thing is though, maintaining a colony is one, unethical, but also it takes money. And again, practically no one has any money, so who's going to pay for it? Well, the Americans are the only ones who do have money and an awe-inspiring economy to boot. For example, in the Rise to Globalism book, historian Stephen E. Ambrose writes, quote, "By 1945, American production had reached levels that were scarcely believable. The United States was producing 45% of the world's arms and nearly 50% of the world's goods. 2/3 of all ships afloat were American built," unquote. The thing is, the Americans at this point have no interest in bankrolling European ambitions. The Americans and the Soviets both opposed imperialism, at least as a concept, and so long as it wasn't their own. But the Roosevelt and Truman administration both looked down on it. Also, and not to get ahead of myself, but while the Americans did oppose colonialism, it wasn't necessarily totally out of idealism either. The post-war Asia situation was incredibly messy, and the Americans wanted preferential treatment in Asian markets, but also to prevent communism. These were the principal objectives for the US and Asia post-1945. So if it looked like a European was going to hamper those objectives, as with the Dutch and the East Indies, they got pressured. Although, with the French in Vietnam, their imperialism could be explained as combating communism, which garnered leniency from the Americans and ultimately pulled the US into the mire when the French failed. That, however, is a story for another time. The point is, the British in May 1945 could not reliably know if their empire would survive the 40s. They barely even knew if they would survive the 40s. So, on the geopolitical stage, things looked pretty bleak for London, and this was especially worrisome because of the men in the East, the Soviets. Churchill spent years rallying against the communists, and it's one of those great ironies that he ended up fighting a war with them. The problem now, though, as far as Churchill was concerned, was that one continental threat was replaced by another. Given that the Soviets were now in the middle of Europe, the question was, how do you get them out of there? That's not an easy conundrum to solve because the Red Army is quite a force and it paid a high price on their crusade west, so Stalin was in no humour to retreat back to Moscow. Of course, Churchill knew this and it bothered him to no end. Again, his choices were limited. He had two options and he tried both. You could try to salvage what you can by dealing with the Soviets directly, or you could rely on a kind of united front with the Americans to pressure the Soviets. For the first option, he actually did this with the Balkans. In 1944, Churchill made a percentages agreement with Stalin, offering him defined zones of interests split to varying degrees between the two. For example, Romania would be 90% in Moscow's sphere, Yugoslavia would be 50-50, and Greece would be 90% London's sphere of interest. This was important to the British because keeping the Soviets out of Greece meant that the Mediterranean could be more easily secured, which meant the Suez could be more easily secured, which meant the direct line to the rest of the empire was still secure. Keep Greece in the back of your mind though, because it becomes a flashpoint later on. Anyways, Stalin takes the note, seemingly agreeing to it, and in fairness, He does stay out of Greece, which compels the British to stay out of Romania. But while a kind of understanding had been reached at the Balkans, imperfect as it was, Central Europe was a different story, and salvation there could only be found through the Americans. The problem was, the Americans were still playing nice. Remember, the US at this point wasn't hysterically anti-communist like they would be in a few years. The sentiments were simmering under there for sure, you've seen what people were saying, but they hadn't gone supernova yet, especially in relation to policy. The US wanted a good, stable, working relationship with Moscow, and also get them into the war with Japan. But to do that, it meant a good first impression, keeping Yalta agreements and not holding onto land that wasn't theirs to hold. For example, the Americans wouldn't try to take Berlin, something Churchill had desperately wanted, and a decision, at least according to Truman, that the Americans later came to regret. Although the Soviets greatly appreciated, it should be said, apparently they thought that was Eisenhower's doing, and Stalin, apparently, according to Khrushchev anyways, thought that Eisenhower was like the utmost gentleman because of it. Churchill was horrified though that the Americans were giving up strategically useful land, and furthermore, that they weren't even going to stay in Europe. So he does his damnedest to try to convey the gravity of the Soviet threat to Truman. In mid-May, he writes a pleading letter to the president in the starkest language he could muster. Churchill says, quote, "I fear terrible things have happened during the Russian advance through Germany to the Elbe. The proposed withdrawal of the United States Army to the occupational lines, which were arranged with the Russians and the Americans in Quebec, and which were marked in yellow on the maps we studied there, would mean the tide of Russian domination sweeping forward 120 miles on a front of 300 or 400 miles. This would be an event which, if it occurred, would be one of the most melancholy in history," unquote. He writes on, quote, "After it was over and the territory occupied by the Russians, Poland would be completely engulfed and buried deep in Russian-occupied lands. What would in fact be the Russian frontier would run from the North Cape in Norway along the Finnish-Swedish frontier, across the Baltic to a point just east of Lübeck, along the present agreed line of occupation, and along the frontier between Bavaria to Czechoslovakia, to the frontiers of Austria, which is nominally to be in quadruple occupation, and halfway across that country to the Isonzo River, behind which Tito and the Russians would claim everything to the east. Thus, the territories under Russian control would include the Baltic provinces, all of Germany to the occupational line, all Czechoslovakia, a large part of Austria, the whole of Yugoslavia, Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria, until Greece, in her present tottering condition, is reached. It would include all the great capitals of Middle Europe, including Berlin, Vienna, Budapest, Belgrade, Bucharest, and Sofia. The position of Turkey and Constantinople will certainly come immediately into discussion," he continues. "This constitutes an event in the history of Europe to which there has been no parallel, and which has not been faced by the Allies in their long and hazardous struggle. The Russian demands on Germany for reparations alone will be such as to enable her to prolong the occupation almost indefinitely. At any rate, for many years, during which time Poland will sink with many other states into the vast zone of Russia-controlled Europe. Not necessarily economically Sovietized, but police-governed. It is just about time that these formidable issues were examined between the principal powers as a whole. We have several powerful bargaining counters on our side, the use of which might make for a peaceful agreement. First, the Allies ought not to retreat from their present positions to the occupational line until we are satisfied about Poland and also about the temporary character of the Russian occupation of Germany and the conditions to be established in the Russianized or Russian-controlled countries in the Danube Valley, particularly Hungary, Austria, and Czechoslovakia and the Balkans. Secondly, we may be able to please them about the exits from the Black Sea and the Baltic as part of a general settlement. All these matters can only be settled before the United States armies in Europe are weakened. If they are not settled before the United States armies withdraw from Europe and the Western world folds up its war machines, there are no prospects of a satisfactory solution and very little of preventing a third world war. It is to this early and speedy showdown and settlement with Russia that we must now turn our hopes. Meanwhile, I am against weakening our claim against Russia on behalf of Poland in any way. I think it should stand where it was put in the telegrams from the president and me, unquote. Truman was not very receptive to this speech, and Churchill writes him again in a similarly grave tone. He writes, quote, I learned that half the American Air Force in Europe has already begun to move to the Pacific Theater. The newspapers are full of the great movements of the American armies out of Europe. Our armies also are under previous arrangements likely to undergo a marked reduction. The Canadian army will certainly leave. The French are weak and difficult to deal with. Anyone can see that in a very short space of time, our armed power on the continent will have vanished, except for the moderate forces to hold down Germany. He continues, quote, Meanwhile, what is to happen about Russia? I have always worked for a friendship with Russia, but like you, I feel deep anxiety because of their misrepresentation of the Yalta decisions, their attitude towards Poland, their overwhelming influence in the Balkans except Greece, the difficulties they make about Vienna, the combination of Russian power and the territories under their control or occupied, coupled with the communist technique in so many other countries, and above all, their power to maintain very large armies in the field for a long time. What will be the position in a year or two, when the British and American armies have melted and the French has not yet been formed on any major scale? When we may have a handful of divisions, mostly French, and when Russia may choose to keep 200 or 300 on active service? An iron curtain is drawn upon their front. We do not know what is going on behind. There seems little doubt that the whole of the regions east of the line of the Lubeck-Trieste-Corfu will soon be completely in their hands. To this must be added the further enormous area conquered by the American armies between Eisenach and the Elbe, which will I suppose in a few weeks be occupied, when the Americans retreat, by the Russian power. All kinds of agreements will have to be made by General Eisenhower to prevent another immense flight of the German population westward as this enormous Muscovite advance into the very centre of Europe takes place. And then the curtain will descend again to a very large extent, if not entirely. Thus, a broad band of many hundreds of miles of Russian-occupied territory will isolate us from Poland. Meanwhile, the attention of our people will be occupied in inflicting severities upon Germany, which is ruined and prostrate, and it would be open to the Russians in a very short time to advance, if they chose, to the waters of the North Sea and the Atlantic. He ends it off by saying, Surely it is vital now to come to an understanding with the Russians, or see where we are with her, before we weaken our armies mortally or retire to the zones of occupation. This can only be done by a personal meeting. I should be most grateful for your opinion and advice. Of course, we may take the view that Russia will behave impeccably, and no doubt that offers the most convenient solution. To sum up, this issue of a settlement with Russia before our strength has gone seems to me to dwarf all others. Unquote. Truman again replies with great disinterest, and this kind of sums up their relationship at the time. Truman complained that Churchill was giving him as many problems as Stalin did. Stalin, for his part, did not like the British very much, and he let it be known often. For example, he told the Germans in 1939, quote, The Soviet government never had sympathy for England. It is only necessary to glance at the works of Lenin and his pupils to understand that the Bolsheviks always cursed and hated England above all. Unquote. Another time, he told Jill Asmalovin, who I mentioned earlier, that, quote, Perhaps you think that just because we are allies of the English, that we have forgotten who they are and who Churchill is. They find nothing sweeter than to trick their allies. During the First World War, they constantly tricked the Russians and the French. And Churchill is the kind who, if you don't watch him, will slip a kopeck out of your pocket. Yes, a kopeck out of your pocket. By God, a kopeck out of your pocket. And Roosevelt is not like that. He dips in his hand only for bigger coins. But Churchill even for a kopeck. Unquote. To cap off the point, when the US sent the all-powerful Roosevelt advisor Harry Hopkins over to Moscow in late May 1945, the memorandum about that meeting writes, quote, Marshal Stalin replied that the reason for the failure on the Polish question was that the Soviet Union desired to have a friendly Poland, but that Great Britain wanted to revive the system of a cordon sanitaire on the Soviet borders. Mr. Hopkins replied that neither the government nor the people of the United States had any such intention. Marshal Stalin replied that he was speaking only of England, and said that the British Conservatives did not desire to see a Poland friendly to the Soviet Union. Unquote. To touch on Hopkins' journey to Moscow for a second. It was overall to save the US-Soviet relationship, even with Poland being a main objective to sort out. Hopkins was very sick, by the way. I mean, bedridden. It's amazing that he went. To give you an idea of how ill he was, he'd actually die a few months later. Hopkins was initially kind of reluctant to do it, but he agreed after a little bit of convincing from Boland and Harriman. Hopkins' motivations for going, according to Navy Secretary James Forrestal, was, quote, he thought it was of vital importance that we not be manoeuvred into a position where Great Britain had us lined up with them in a block against Russia, unquote. The Hopkins meeting would be a prelude to the bigger meeting of Potsdam, where the leaders hammer out negotiations in person and the fate of the world gets decided upon temporarily. Anyways, I'll cover the Hopkins trip onwards in the next episode. I think it's a good place to call it here. If you've been listening up to this point, I greatly thank you for that. It's a different format for me. I don't know if I'll keep it. I'm kind of just, I did it by accident. Initially, it was supposed to be, edited. And then it just got too big with too much information. And I thought, look, I'll just do an audio version and go from there. If you enjoyed it though, let me know, because I have no idea how this is going to turn out. But yes, thank you very much. If there's episode 2, which I hope there will be, in whatever format it is, I hope you stick around to see it.